just going to share this screen with you, Connor.
All right, it's recording now anyway.
Cool. Cool. Nice slideshow. Can you see that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's up on screen.
Up on screen. Cool.
Maybe an introduction or something. Maybe like if you want to give like a basic introduction to David Hawkins or something, or his works, or
yeah,
what you feel is appropriate.
Cool. Yeah. So this is a seminar I made a year ago, and I intended to run an event on it, which I never did. And this, I've called it Levels of Energy Theory, and it was my attempt to understand the ideas of David Hawkins, who wrote a famous book called Power versus Force, and he's written a bunch of other really interesting books, Letting Go, The Eye of the Eye. Like, there's a few really amazing titles by David Hawkins, and what I really like about his work is just there's like a kind of aura to it that just resonates. Like, it feels very true. It feels it's kind of how I can say it, really. And I think it really stands out reading his work versus other works, really. Like, it's very powerful, and there's a lot of wisdom, I think, embedded in what he's saying. It's very, very informed, what he's saying, and it's coming from a really, really interesting place. And so I won't go too much into his ideas because we're going to cover that now, but his basic ideas, basically he offers us a model for understanding the mind, consciousness and values and the soul. And he kind of offers us a kind of progression of energy from lower negative energy fields or states to higher positive energy fields or states. I think this corresponds to the spectrum of human emotion, but it also corresponds to objects, doesn't it? So he will talk, or just places. So he'll talk about the forest, or like St. Paul's Cathedral or something like that. He'll say these places have an aura, or like an energy field that makes those in its presence go strong, because of the integrity of the energy, or weak, because of the level of the energy. So that's his work. Find it really interesting. I know you're familiar with it. What's your perspective on him?
Yeah. I mean, I just to add in maybe a few more bits based on what you were saying. That's a really good summary, and I think as well, just important to like maybe highlight a bit about his background as well. Like, so I think he dealt with like depression, anxiety, and the usual gamut of emotions that most people deal with. And at a certain point, he went through some kind of a spiritual awakening, or using his idea of the scale of consciousness or the levels of energy, he kind of shot up through those levels of energy to like a higher state. So he got a glimpse of like a higher state of being. I think one was when he was like actually very young as a child.
That's right. Yeah.
He was in like a winter storm or something, and suddenly he just had this incredible sense of like love and peace and bliss. And I think, a lot of people have had some glimpses like that in their lives, like however brief, that you get connected to something more joyous, more loving, more peaceful, even if it's something like looking at a sunset, or like a moment when your mind just stills in the heart of nature, or a moment with loved one, or whatever, And on the flip side, we've also experienced the negatives. We've experienced like anxiety, we've experienced anger, pride, and envy. These emotions, as I'm sure we'll get into in greater detail on the call. But so basically, his work it's a framework, or it's a tool to view the human emotions and to approach them, and to even begin processing them, so that we can begin to move up to higher levels of energy. So his book Letting Go would really cover that whole aspect. He actually offers a technique that's deceptively simple but apparently very effective, and it's something I'm personally experimenting with on and off. And it's basically just about like letting go, like so fully allowing, accepting whatever emotions are present. And it's offering a different way of dealing with emotions apart from, like, let's say, expression or suppression or repression, what we'd be most familiar with. And yeah, what you mentioned as well about like people, places and things, you know, that's what I find really fascinating about his work, as well as that it can be applied to pretty much anything you can think of, any person, place or thing. According to his work, everything has like a calibration, or you could say like a level of energy or a frequency. And what I really like about this as well is that it all ties back into, you know, these ideas from quantum physics that we hear a lot about in the spiritual community and a lot of spiritual circles, of how, you know, everything is interconnected, and how everything has certain energy to it, or frequency or vibration. And for me, like David Hawkins' works, it adds some substance to those words. You know, like you hear those words kind of thrown around a lot, like, oh, vibration, frequency. But studying this, it gives you a really solid framework of understanding for
It's like a map.
Yeah, exactly, for what that's pointing to.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I really love his ideas as well about like attractor fields, I think they're called. You know, how there's like these.
Let's walk through it a little bit.
We won't go too deep into it.
Yeah, so this presentation, we're basically going to go through, it's quite a simple one. We're just going to go through basically the spectrum of emotions. It won't be exhaustive, but at the beginning, there's a little bit about attractor patterns, so maybe we'll cover that. Can I just click? Yes. Cool. So I wonder what you think of. Yeah, I mean, let's go into it first. But this is kind of like the content of the presentation. In the beginning, levels of energy, just attractor patterns, and kind of setting the paradigm or setting the frame for the conversation. Section 1, ego. Those are the values of shame and guilt, all the way up to want, desire, anger, and pride, and they are the force attractors, as I understand it. This is kind of my interpretation, but just kind of as I understand it. You then have rational empowerment, which is my term, which is where you move from pride to courage. And so now for this, I kind of think of kind of typical ideas of success, you know, like financial success or material success, or, you know, just make something of your life. Maybe Tony Robbins, I kind of think about as this kind of level, this shift from victim to, you know, empowered, someone who's going to go out into the adventure of life. But then that's still within a dualistic paradigm, as I understand it. When you go from courage up into intellect and into rationality, you can still live in that frequency and generate some really positive results in your life, materially speaking. But maybe it's still success is out there kind of thing, and one's sense of self hasn't come full circle, as I understand it. And then you know, the next major division in the energy fields is between reason or rationality and love.
I like that breakdown. So yes, I like the term rational empowerment. Like, I've not heard that used in this context. I think that's a good one, and I like this division you created between the three areas, like ego, rational empowerment, and surrender. Like, I think that's a good way of framing it. And I suppose just like a caveat, like, I suppose it's about shifting from the negative emotions towards the positive emotions increasingly, you know. And I suppose you could say that the section of the ego, it's predominantly negative, you know. As I'm sure we'll get into the different emotions soon, but as you get into the rational empowerment, then you're starting to get more positivity and starting out with that level of courage and going from there. And I suppose that's where a lot of the world is at least, let's say, the Western world. It's kind of very much in the rational brain, logic. And you can say with like science that that's been maximized to the fullest extent possible. Like it's interesting that I think he calibrated like certain scientists that they calibrated at like 499 or something, which is like right before the breakthrough into love and I suppose surrender. So I just think that's a good way of framing it. So I suppose let's get into it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So levels of energy. We've touched a little bit on this. Here's an image of the chakras, which is another kind of model he uses. We've touched on a lot of it. Mainly, this is an ancient idea from the Vedic tradition, is that coiled within us energetically is the great serpent of the Kundalini, which is an immense creative and energetic potentiality that lies dormant within the human soul. That's the Vedic Kundalini chakra idea, as I understand it, and the goal of life in many ways is to arouse and awaken the Kundalini, and this progresses through energetic stages and frequencies. And I think Hawkins himself makes this quite explicit, that it maps onto the chakras. And so the idea is an increasing energetic potentiality, awakening. And it's also like a Russian doll as well, as I understand it, where you kind of move through a space and integrate that space, and then into another space and then integrate that too.
It's interesting the way you can look at it from a couple of angles. That on the one hand, like I love this this idea actually of the chakras first of all. But like when you look at this picture here, you can see that it appears to be going up. That would be the assumption. You're going up from the base, which is more primal desires. I suppose hooked in with the reptilian brain, and then you're moving up. Heart chakra or solar plexus, heart chakra, then up into throat chakra, third eye, crown, where it becomes more spiritual. But then, just as you said, that's very true as well. Like this idea of the Russian doll, or I like to use the analogy of the onion. Like in both cases, you're peeling back layers. So what I like about that perspective is that it shows that rather than something that you're trying to attain, it's already within you. These states are already within you, and I think that really correlates with David Hawkins' teaching as well. Is that again, it's like this famous analogy in meditation of the sun breaking through the clouds, that these positive states are in a way your birthright. They're who you truly are, they're your truest self. But you could say that through, I guess, for so many reasons, like generational conditioning, trauma, and just the energy on the planet of the collective, that it gets clouded over by these lower states. I suppose in a way the spiritual journey that we're on is about peeling back those layers, or opening up the Russian doll, as you said. So I like that analogy as well. It's good.
Yeah, nice. I've been trying to answer that question in an online course I'm working on at the moment, which is there's lots of thoughts on it, right? Like the Maya. I think the Buddhists have the idea of the Maya, which means the veil of illusion. And at the moment, what I'm trying to unpack is the myth of Saturn, and what that basically means is like, or in the Gnostic theology, basically, like they have the idea of the archons, which are basically spirits whose intent is to keep you asleep, and kind of basically at the frequency of the lower chakras, essentially. And basically the idea would be that we're like seduced into the values of the ego by society, by influence, by different philosophies and different worldviews and stuff, and that there's some kind of energetic prison in a way, like keeping that locked, and then but as you say, it's kind of like our birthright to awaken our consciousness and to realize the nature of things. But yeah.
Yeah, I
So
like that idea as well, actually, of I suppose, yeah, I resonate with Gnosis and Gnosticism in general. And I think it's just clear to see for everybody, you know, that that's the case. Like whatever lens you want to look at it through, or whatever philosophy you resonate with, like it's definitely a case that society at large, it does tend to entrain us to these lower patterns, these lower frequencies, you know. So I think that's,
and our biology does as well, right? So that's
yeah,
why it's the root chakra, because like you've got like sexual desire and aggression, and it's like it's a meditation basically to come to awareness of the layers and the levels of yourself and move the energy up.
the biology part is definitely 100% true. And I think maybe even it's the biology that's driving society, that it's like, you know, collectively we were living from those lower desires and it shaped society, but now it's like we're within that society, but we're trying to transcend individually and collectively, but that old pattern, that old system is still there, you know.
um, yeah, and so yeah, we've talked. So what does it say here? The attractor. Oh, attractor is the name given to an identifiable pattern that emerges from a seemingly unmeaningful mass of data. There is a hidden coherence in all that appears incoherent. Some patterns are very powerful, and others are much weaker. Yeah, so we've covered this a bit, and I think this is words from David Hawkins. I love that. It's a pattern. It's the metaphor I've been really liking is the metaphor of a lens. So like a lens is invisible because it's like behind the eye, or like the eyes through which you see it, like it's invisible, like you can't see it, and yet it conditions perception. It conditions perception. It conditions what phenomena actually shine forth and what things are noticed. And I think that's what values do. And I think this is what David Hawkins' great contribution is that he's giving us a map of values, and the values are the lenses, and they can be negative or positive, and they're almost dynamically in competition in many ways in space and in the places we go and all the different things in society. That's kind of how I see it. But it's like, yeah, and it's also an energy and a yeah. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
That's definitely good insight. Like I didn't really consider it from that angle, you know, of like lenses, but it's I definitely see that, you know, like it's, and the fact that he's giving us a value set as well. Like I agree with that he's like providing us a map of those things which are powerful and those things which are weak or weakening, you know, that will actually weaken us or empower us. So I think his works are unique in a way in that he's so clearly showing us what things to associate with and what not, or what to avoid, you know, and what things will assist us on the journey. But in terms of the attractor patterns, like I tend to see it, yeah, from the angle of like energy fields, you know, like I see it as, I suppose like the basic view would be like, yeah, we have this physical reality, and this is what David Hawkins talks about as well. We have this physical reality. Behind it then is like a metaphysical reality, you know, where there's, you know, energies, archetypes. This really ties in with the Jungian stuff as well, which I know you love. And yeah, in terms of like attractor fields, I also see it. So I see it as like for everything or every person or place or group, there's a field behind it. There's like a field of energy that lends it power in a way, you know, and certain different degrees of power. And another way that I see it is like attractor patterns. It ties in with the idea of morphic resonance as well by Rupert Sheldrake. So he's a British scientist, kind of a renegade scientist, that he has very alternative ideas. But I think there could be a lot of truth in what he's researching, what he shares. And one idea is like morphic resonance. And again, it all ties together, you know. It's when you look into the metaphysical, it's all about how everything is connected, and there's fields of energy. And when an individual or a collective does something, it makes it easier for others to then connect into that action or to replicate it, you know. So I think we see that with the attractor patterns as well, that let's say, you know, if you want to take a negative example, like you have heavy metal music or something, you know, like that is a field of energy, and people tuning into that energy, it makes them more negative. So it's like the energy spreads as well, you know, so positive and negative. So
yeah, and yeah, well, and Jung, there's a bit of feedback now. Yeah, Jung's idea was with the archetypes is that they're basically ancient memories in the collective soul, and like yeah, ancestral memory is embedded in the human soul, and like that means the pain and the suffering. So like I haven't been to Auschwitz, but I was watching a documentary on like the World War II last night, and like Auschwitz comes to mind as like a place where a ancestral memory has been like embedded in the place, and like yeah, like that's a negative example. And like another classic example in a lot of self-help is was it Roger Bannister who did the 4-minute mile? Have you heard of that? It's like
yeah.
So like no one had run a 4-minute mile before in human history. It was not conceived to be possible. It was not believed to be possible. And then Roger Bannister did it, and then thereafter everyone else started doing it, you know. And so I think both of those are kind of negative and positive examples of like the idea that the collective consciousness absorbs the acts and the achievements and the deeds of souls in the past.
Yeah, I think like the importance, or one of the important things with this, is just the understanding that, you know, it's not just the material world and it's not just the brain. Like, yes, our mind, it's like our mind uses the brain as like, let's say, a radio receiver where it's getting signals coming in and out. And it's a case of the mind goes far beyond the brain as well. You know, there's this metaphysical world, which is basically an unseen world that's behind and beyond this one. And our mind dwells there as well as individuals, but it's like they connect to like a greater collective. You could say the human consciousness, you know, the human collective consciousness, and there's a lot of ideas there as well that influence us.
100%. So yeah, this was an image of the this is from chaos theory, which Hawkins talks about. This is an attractor pattern called it's the butterfly effect. It's like the butterfly pattern, and this relates to this is another rabbit hole, but this is the idea that that events and systems are dependent on initial conditions, and that one small change or one small alteration in the initial conditions of a system really influence how that turns out. And so it's basically the idea that small things have big effects, but in a non-linear kind of way. And so I think that ties into all of these ideas in terms of like what we do matters, what we think matters, how we feel matters, how our soul is constituted and ordered or not. It all matters, and it all affects everything. I think that's stressed in his work as well.
I feel like a strong resonance with this image, like since he mentioned it in the book, you know, he calls it, I think it's also called the Lorenz attractor. I think maybe after somebody who worked with it, but I always felt like a strong resonance with this image, and I think it's a large part of it is what you described. You know, that it's very empowering in a way. It shows that in basically one image or one symbol, it's showing that yeah, just our power, you know, the power of our thoughts, the power of our intentions, the power of our emotions, that we are connected with the world at large, you know, that the world is a reflection of us. All of these ideas, it's just shown in one experiment, in one image, which is this. And I think like some of the examples of where this was showing up was, I think they studied like weather patterns, and, you know, there was things like rogue waves, you know, that they're just complete anomalies, and they show up very randomly, and they can't really predict it, you know, that there's these events that happen beyond the logical mind, that they happen beyond, you know, calculation, and it's just, there's these other forces at play, and it ties in with, you know, what we talked about with this metaphysical world and energy fields and all of that. So yeah, I think it's awesome.
There's another quote from Hawkins. A field of dominance is exhibited by high energy patterns in their influence over weaker ones. The phenomenological universe is the expression of the interaction of endless attractor patterns of varying strength. Yeah, this means that our experience is the interplay of competing value systems, and something, the idea of dominance and stronger and weaker is interesting as well, because I think an example that Hawkins cites is Gandhi and the British Empire. And also, if you think of World War II, the victory of the Allied powers over Nazi Germany, like those two examples, or the end of the Soviet Union as well, like some of these big historical events in the 20th century exhibit evidence of the idea that it's like kind of like truth prevails, and that Winston Churchill was an embodiment of courage, for example, to stand up to Hitler. And I think that rallied a deep resonance in the soul of many nations, and you know, called forth a higher principle, the principle of unity over separation. And like the drama, the horrific drama of the 20th century, I think played out some of these, the interplay of different patterns and different fields of ideas, and you know, while liberal democratic societies aren't perfect, I think one of the things is that the struggle between liberalism and socialism during the 20th century is one of the great ideological struggles of humanity, and it really does hinge upon the Judeo-Christian notion of individual liberty. Basically, it was like a bloody war over the power of that idea. And I think that sorry, I went off a bit of a tangent, but I think that's kind of what's being talked about here in terms of field of dominance. And the kind of idea is that virtues or like good principles have a intrinsic integrity that kind of like, they're more integrated than less integrated value systems, basically, and therefore when they butt heads, the weaker value system will collapse.
Yeah, that's incredible. I agree with most what you said there. You know, like I love the example of Gandhi versus the British Empire, and I want to throw in another example here, because I know you saw this as well. I put up a post on Facebook about the Lord of the Rings, that I was looking at the symbolism of that, you know, and there was one scene in particular, where, you know, I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with it, where if they've seen it, that Sam and Frodo are going up Mount Doom to destroy the One Ring. You know, there's loads of symbolism there already, you know, what the one ring means and all of that. But basically, Frodo is like straining with the burden of the ring. You know, it's corrupting his mind and all of that. And there's this epic scene where Sam is like reminding Frodo of the beauty of, you know, the Shire and the beauty of the world and all of this. And he says, essentially, after Frodo sees Sauron and he feels overcome by that power or that force, you could say, that Sam is like, I can't carry the ring for you, but I can carry you. And it's this moment of courage, you know, which shows it correlates with Hawkins' work. And it's also what I realized in that was like, it's beautiful in the Lord of the Rings. Like Tolkien, the creator, he shows that, you know, the forces of goodness, they, because of these energies we're talking about that are motivating all of their actions, they're more inclined to, you know, come together to help each other out, to, to be there in moments of weakness. Whereas, just as you said, you know, the forces of darkness, they're operating from these lower emotions, these lower desires, and it's one of separation, you know, where they see each other as separate. They don't necessarily come to each other's aid and all of that. And I think there's 1,000 different ways that shows up, but basically, like what we're getting at here is these negative energies, they carry within like the seed of their own downfall, you know, whereas the positive energies, they're more supportive, they're more integrative, and that in a way is very hopeful and inspiring, I think, because it's like, no matter, you know, because you do get this sense that just living in a world that darkness prevails, you know, that a lot of times people get away with bad things, a lot of times, you know, there's a lot of atrocities, but I think there's inspiration in the works of Hawkins and what he teaches, that, you know, all of that is like a mirage. At the end of the day, it is true what they say, that love conquers all, you know, love will prevail, that these higher states will have the last say because they're inherently more powerful. And I think the example you gave as well of Gandhi versus the British Empire is another perfect example, you know, because like, here's this one scrawny man and he's in abject poverty, and he takes on like the largest empire in the world at the time, you know, and they ultimately succumb to his ideas and the movement that creates, you know. So it's, again, perfect example. It just shows the power of it, you know.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like huge theme. So I don't know, I've got these vision here, but is yeah, illustrating that idea of that some values are stronger than others and some are weaker. So yeah, I'm just going through a bit of Hawkins' theory here in the beginning, just to set the scene, and then we can dive in a bit more to the actual kind of energies. So we can intuit then an infinite domain of infinite potential, consciousness itself, within which there is an enormously powerful attractor field organizing all of human behavior into what is innate to humanness. Within the giant attractor field are sequential fields of progressively less energy and power. These fields in turn dominate behavior, so that definite patterns are consistent across cultures and time throughout human history. So yeah, that last bit of patterns consistent across cultures and time, those are Jungian archetypes. Essentially, it's a very complex idea, Jung's archetypes, but that's basically what it means. Is that he called them the eternal images, and Jung thought that these eternal images were the source of wisdom, health, wholeness, happiness. Like we really, they nourish us in the deepest sense. Contact, living contact, ritual contact with these eternal images. You know, the image of hope, the image of faith, the image of love, the image of truth, like these things. And yeah, we kind of just covered it, but like that idea is huge in Hawkins's work. And they're eternal images because they're in some sense outside of historical time. So love, for example, or if you call love, if you think of love as care for the other, then purely from a biological lens, that is, you know, you're 25, I'm 26, like that's this splice of historical time. And then the archetype of love activates itself within the drama of our lives, but that energy is like biologically ancient, like it's just so ancient. Same with truth. And so that's kind of the idea that's being got at here, I think.
I don't want to add too much here. Like, I just think that this part is just reiterating, what we talked about as well, that there's this metaphysical realm, there's ideas there, there's concepts, archetypes, and I think everybody does this intuitively. We all tap into these archetypes, but I think bringing that into conscious awareness, which I feel like a lot of what this work is about, that can be helpful too, that you can gain a greater understanding by being consciously aware of them, love, truth, everything that you talked about. So
yeah, that's a good point to just observe, because if you think of the human soul or the self as a musical symphony, then it's kind of like a chaotic emotional space is like a discordance or a lack of harmony in the symphony. But a harmony in the symphony is a synchronization. Synchrony means together in time. If ideas come together in time, that's what harmony is. And I think the point you touched on is basically what we're doing here is we move these, as you say, everyone understands these images implicitly. They can watch Lord of the Rings, they can watch things, they can listen to music, they can go, have relationships and understand these archetypes and wrestle with them. But they're implicit. The information's implicit and embedded in image, and it's not necessarily made explicit and conscious, which means that light is not necessarily shone on it. And so kind of what we're doing is bringing the head and the heart, like what we know in our heart, into alignment with what we can consciously articulate and say in our head. And that's like a synchronous moment where
heart-brain coherence.
Yeah, greater coherence. Yeah. Cool. So here are some kind of artistic renditions of the ideas we've talked about. This is another idea of the attractor, like the one attractor with the one source of light, which then ripples out a multiplicity of light, which is what the rainbow is. Newton figured that out, like it's one light fundamentally, but there's different levels of color, different hues.
I think that's an archetypal image as well, though, isn't it? Like, just in general,
yeah,
the idea of light shining out, and it's like, but the light is a source, a great source, it's like it. Yeah, can you hear me?
Connor?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you. Your video seems. Oh yeah, you're back.
Oh yeah, it kind of just lagged there for a while. I don't know, but yeah, I was just saying, like, that's an archetypal image, isn't it? Like the sunlight coming out, even the sun. It's like it's just a source of energy, this infinite field of energy,
Yeah. It's like everything we're talking about is a rabbit hole, but let's just keep talking about it. But like this image in particular, you're correct. The alchemy. This is an alchemical image as well of they called it sol in Latin, means sun, and it's also the Python. It's also the Python. It's an ice cream truck.
That's an attractor field of an ice cream truck.
Yeah. What was I saying? Sun. Yeah, the monads. This is the Pythagorean monad. It's the one and the source of all multiplicity. And it's funny as well because like the idea that we're like made in the image of God. Well, like for many cultures, the sun was naturally enough considered to be God because it is the life giver. And the sun, if you look at it, is like this kind of structure. This is how we might model it. And this is also how we might model the solar system, right? And this is also the shape of your eye.
Yeah.
So like that's one of the above below things, right? Is like it's like we're literally microcosms, like we are microcosmos, like because I went into this for my last seminar. It's just such a fascinating continuity of the pattern that this image is both a deep archetype and literally written into the physical.
There's some amazing examples of that, like just seeing the patterns going from higher levels down to, I suppose, quote unquote, lower levels, you know, from a physical perspective. But like, yeah, just what you said is, you know, like the sun, the eye, like if you look, I think there was some kind of a meme or like a viral image of the networks or the neurons in the brain, and then an image of the superclusters in the universe. You know, it was all like these vein structures, so it just shows how it's repeating. And talking about the eye as well, I suppose there's this other element. It's kind of interconnected of like the holographic universe. Like I think one example of that is if you look at the eye, or also if you look at the foot, every part of the body is displayed kind of almost like a map on those organs and probably elsewhere. It's like this idea that everything contains everything else, you know. So you even have the study called iridology in the naturopathic community, whereby it said that the eye, and it looks very similar to that slide, it's like the eye, it shows weaknesses and strengths in all the different parts of the body, you know, it's all represented. So I think that's an incredible point as well.
Yeah, no, totally. This idea of embeddedness. There's an amazing TED lecture on it. What are they called? Fractals. This is a fractal image here. I've seen fractals during a psychedelic experience. I think which is strange and beautiful because it just showed me the language of the universe in many ways, because like what we're talking about, this idea is the idea of fractals, and that is the idea that any system or moment is in some sense embedded in a greater system and moment, but it's the interrelationship of all things. And that and this is I think the foundation for the true perspective that nothing you do doesn't matter. Like the thing is that like wherever you're at in the spiral of your life, you know, whether it's a career or a relationship you're not happy with, or just a phase in your life you're not happy with, the thing is that if you go to work on improving your consciousness, your attitude to that, and you do that kind of alchemy of the mind of like transforming the lens basically, then the thing is that that does very literally affect every other decision and every other project you endeavor upon. And so I think there is an attitude. Sorry, no, I think there is I think what can keep people stuck is the opposite of that perspective, which is to say, oh, you know, that's, you know, this thing doesn't matter that much. You know, this job, I don't really like this job that much. Like, why exert energy and effort into this? You know, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, I think this fractal truth really speaks to the contrary, and actually, like, every moment, every splice of your life is embedded in
That's super powerful, and I think it's, yeah, like what you talked about is like a frame of disempowerment versus empowerment. You know, like embracing this fractal consciousness, as you call it, is like, yeah, it all leads back to kind of the typical stuff that's talked about. You know, like things like gratitude. You know, things like letting go, like David Hawkins talks about. It's about, as you beautifully put it, it's like the alchemy of the mind. You know, and changing that lens. And I think that is super powerful. And I think that's all work that we're engaged in, you know, like seeing that day to day, like, you know, doubts come up, fears come up, there's something you're not happy with. And I think in a way that's the journey that we're on, is like learning that alchemy, you know, learning to shift the perspective. And this is, just to give one example, it's talked a lot about in the book Reality Transurfing by Vadim Zeland. He's like a Russian astrophysicist originally, but he got into this whole area, and that book I found very fascinating as well. I definitely saw correlation between the teachings of that book and David Hawkins stuff as well, and also people like Eckhart Tolle. So again, I think it just shows that it all connects together. Like the truths are the truths, you know, and it's just different perspectives, different lenses. So yeah, you know.
Yeah, totally. Skipped over some. Yeah, I think we've established some of the main paradigms. We'll go into the bit of the energies. This is just one from is kind of I think that's a pretty amazing image. Like this is an illustration of the lower energies transforming into the higher energies, and the monad, the light, the sun, the star. The sun is the star, the source of that white light, and then it differentiates out into that red hue, that yellow, that green, up the colors. And again, with this fractal idea, wherever you're at in that progression is actually a part of the broader unity and process. And so I think there's beauty in every moment of it.
It's powerful as well, the way it all connects, like, you know, the colors, they connect in with the chakra system, the different levels of energy, you know. Yeah, it's incredible. It's a nice image.
Yeah, and then finally, the idea of exponentiality is one we should just note, is that's Hawkins's idea, as I understand it, is that the lower, it's like the lower you are, like the more stuck in anger and greed and these kind of energies, that can be a really hard, heavy, dense energy to shift, and it might take many years of diligent and patient effort to move anything at all. And then maybe if something starts moving, and as we said about courage, once you have the courage to maybe in Alcoholics Anonymous or look at an addiction, or actually that moment shifts and you actually shift from victim to, okay, let me look at this, and then maybe you pick up a book, you have a conversation, and then this exponentiality starts to go, and then it just goes, your consciousness does like this, basically. It starts to accelerate and accelerating.
I wonder, just something that came to mind there briefly was like, I wonder, does that have any tie-in with, you know, what a lot of people talk about of this, I suppose, phenomenological experience of time speeding up, you know, that a lot of people report, it feels like time is speeding up. And I'm wondering, maybe this has a tie-in with the fact that people in general in the modern world, they're beginning to transcend these more very base limiting emotions, you know, and coming into lighter states of being. Maybe there's a tie-in there.
Yeah, and it's also with the generations. Something I've observed is that the young in general are of a lighter energy, and then generationally, I observed it as well. That
100%, yeah, I've seen that as well. You know, like yeah, I was only on a call with a guy yesterday. He was a bit older. He's like 36, and he was saying, you know, I see you guys, and you're really going at it. You know, you're just going all out with these energies. You know, sharing these ideas, and I see the same as well. Like, there's younger guys that I know. There's some guys like 18, 20, and when I see them, like they're incredible, like what they're doing at that age. Like when I was that age, I didn't have that lightness about me, you know. I was mired in these heavier energies. So I think, yeah, what you said is like there is a generational acceleration as well, which is very hopeful, I guess, very inspiring, you know?
Very hopeful, yeah. I think it's the shoulders of giants thing, right? As human knowledge, you know, accumulates and human consciousness really shifts and moves, I think it's a beautiful thing, and it does echo down the generations.
I just want to say one small thing there as well, is like, I think that mirrors with the technology, you know. Like if you look at the technology, it seems like it's exponential too, you know. Like it was very slow with the Industrial Revolution, you know. Before that it was like farming for millennia, and then Industrial Revolution, you've got a period of about 300 years, it's going moderately faster. And then like last 50 years or whatever, you've got like the internet. It seems to be moving towards a singularity, you know, which is tying in with this as well, I think. So it's one part, it's kind of daunting, or it can be scary, but the other side, I think it's inspiring.
Oh no, I think yeah, I mean, another rabbit hole. We'll have yeah. No, like I think you've talked about it with the kingdom of God idea, and like the prophecy, so to speak, well, the prophecy of like the second coming of Christ, and like the idea that Christ will return. Well, what could that mean? Well, if Christ was an attractor field in consciousness, if Christ was a dynamic set of values, truth, love, beauty, harm, like if Christ was those things, and if people seem to be embodying those values more, and we're peace is being established on the earth, and certain values are getting real traction and momentum and embeddedness within the society. Well, I read that if you look at like meta history, or you look at like the big like thing of like time, I see that as a waking up, and in natural systems it's called emergence, like the emergence of a thing that's greater from the sum of its parts. Like, and if you could have a Gaia-sized view of like what's happening here on Earth, it could be like an illumination, because after all, knowledge and consciousness is light. And like, if these observations are true, then like what that means is more light is flowing in to the field of human consciousness, and it's like purging the darkness, and it's actually making the darkness look just like ridiculous. Like, it's just ridiculous. Just ridiculous. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like there's certain like ways of seeing things that are just like being transcended. Like, they are being transcended by the context within which I think our collective consciousness is right now.
Absolutely. And I think like you said, like you hinted at as well, it's like an evolutionary process. And I think like this is something I was writing about recently, because I'm looking to publish a blog on like, who was Jesus Christ? What was his true nature? What was his true mission? And one of the things I touched on was like, what I intuit is the evolutionary process across the whole universe. And I think it's starting out with like, you've got the solids, you've got the planets forming, then it moves to like more rudimentary physicality. And I think that's the stage that we're emerging out of now. The spirit is starting to come into it, and it's accelerating. And I love that perspective of the Gaian system as well. That you can look at it like Gaia, or the Earth. It births an intelligent species of being, so that they can go to this next level, and who knows where it goes from there. But it's exciting.
Yeah, I want to offer a quick alchemical lens on this, because this is a thought that it's just an intuition and a thought I've had, but I think it's an interesting one. Is that like, the alchemists, they saw the world as like, divided into 4 primordial elements, and those elements are water, earth, air, and fire. And you can see the heavy light dynamic in that as well. The ethereal stars above are very light, and then like water is like very dense and heavy. Anyway, a perspective to consider about Earth is that there was no land in the beginning. It was just water. So that's where it started, is water. And then Earth emerged, right? And like, that's what, as you say, like the physical, primates and mammals is what we're called, right? Like, that's all like earthbound stuff. We like eat stuff, and like it's all material and earthbound. And then this like next shift, and we're talking about, I think this is the way I see it, is that it's like an alchemical shift from earth to air. And I think it's correlated with astrology. I don't know a load about astrology, but I think it's like Aries, or there's a new like aeon is coming into being.
Aquarius.
What? Aquarius.
Yeah.
And Aquarius is an air sign, I think. I'm not sure. It's the water bearer, but anyway, my point is that what's air? Air is like spirit. Air is like thought. Air is like what's happening now. Like, you can't touch it, you can't feel it, you can't sense it. It's psyche, it's mind, and like it's like this journey of the emergence of mind out of matter, like water, earth, air, and that's kind of what the internet is too. Like, what is the internet? Can't touch it, can't feel it. Like, no, it's like this ethereal cloud, but it's also synthesizing and computing and analyzing and integrating just like vast quantities of knowledge. And what is knowledge? Knowledge is it's thought philosophically or logically, it's light. It's like it's mind. It's like from the universal truths from the heavens, like. And so like that's just a kind of alchemical fucking dream that I've had. And like and then like the next stage from air to fire is like the singularity idea of like fire is that archetype we just talked about, that like monad, that fire is the divine essence of transformation. And so
yeah, that's incredible. I love that perspective. Like, it's just, I think that sums it up beautifully. You know, that's a good way to cap it off. I think, yeah, just awesome.
yeah, it's a good theme. Right, so how are we going to the rest of the seminar? Cool. So then the 3 sections, let's go through the ego, which are like the lower energy fields. And here's some content of just the way I think of it, and this is kind of my interpretation of Hawkins, and this is kind of reading kind of Freud and Jung in relationship to Hawkins as well. And so I've called it the shame-pride dynamic. It's also prevalent in Robert Moore's King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. He uses this similar model actually, and he calls it like the shadow forms of the archetypes. So the shame-pride dynamic, shame as a fall from the ideal, pride as an attachment to the ideal, ego, self-image, and validation. So for me, the ego is a complex thing, but basically what it comes down to is a false idol, which means an image of a way of being, a lifestyle, an attachment, specific amount of money, a specific car, or a specific thing. And this is the ideal. This is like this really attractive self-image that buoys up and inflates my personality and says, I feel good. Like, I feel good as long as this condition is met here. Like, I feel really good. And if this condition's kept, and then like if anything pokes at the condition, then it reveals this like really terrifying shadow, which is the shame of how I feel when I don't have that. Oh, what if don't have money? What if I'm not successful? What if I'm not these things? And that touches on this complex of shame. And really, if you think of the psychology of shame, like that's really, what would motivate someone to take their own life? What would motivate suicide? Hawkins talks about this, but it's this idea of shame. It's this idea of like this, more than an idea, it's like a field of energy. It's like a very deep emotion of like, I am not worthy, and like I am not worthy according to this image I've set up in my own mind about what worthiness is. So we're touching on obviously an infinitely complex topic, but this is kind of the way I see it. And you've got like this kind of positive end of the spectrum, which is pride, and it's like relatively positive compared to shame, but they're like brothers in a way. It's kind of like, it's like pride hides the shame, and shame bounces back up to pride.
Yeah, it's like a duality or a polarity, And
yeah,
I think it's awesome to highlight that, because I guess that's the realm of the ego, isn't it? That's the realm of, I suppose you could say, the thinking mind as well, to a degree. Like that duality, like it's either negative or it's positive, and we oscillate between the two, and I guess that's the principle of the pendulum as well, like it swings from one side to the other. And as long as you're identified with that, or to the extent that you're identified with that, you're getting bashed around more and more, One moment you're feeling fantastic, and then it just goes to the other extreme. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll start off down at the very bottom of the levels of energy. And so this is kind of like an image of the abyss or the black hole. I've definitely been there. It's like a existential despair or depression, and it's a real dark place to be. It's like nihilistic, no sense of enduring value, and it's really the opposite of the spirit of this whole conversation we've had so far. And it's a real place. It's a real psychological place, and it's like the desert. That's what the ancient image of it was, is the desert. And so you're in the desert of shame and guilt, and so this is like the lower energies, and this is from Freud, and I've always found this very instructive. So he says, one feels guilty, pious people would say sinful, if one has done or even thought something one recognizes as evil. Evil is something for which one is threatened with loss of love. It must therefore be avoided. And Hawkins calls it the state of feeling abandoned by God, or being hopeless, like a godless state. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, this is something I'm trying to cover in my work as well, with my courses and stuff. Like, this is basically, I think, the place that we are when we're not in an orientation to the transcendent. And all that we've talked about is about an orientation to the transcendent, orientation to sacred and divine energy. And in the absence of that, it's like being afloat on at sea without a compass, or without, it's like that, basically, a disoriented state of being washed around by the waves of life and really not seeing any meaning in it. And also specifically with shame and guilt, it's a narrative, it's a story about who I am, and it's a narrative that I have sinned, I am not going to be loved by God, I'm not going to be loved by my parents or society or anyone, and I'm worthless, and like, therefore no one will care if I die, and that's like the narrative of suicide. And yeah, it's really dark, and I think really, really disempowering. But yeah, understandable, right? It's one of the most primordial things, this idea of threatened with loss of love. Like, love is what we all yearn for, and it's understandable that we can find ourselves in such places. But I think, yeah, it might be best to walk through some of these emotions, because I think that this is intrinsically related in the kind of yin and yang sense to that idea of pride, because I really feel that it is, to the extent that we're attached to an image of how things are supposed to be, in whatever sense that is. Oh, things are supposed to be this way, I'm supposed to be at this place at this time in my career, or whatever, they're supposed to be this way and they're not. I think that is the big source of the suffering. That's a real attachment to how things should be, and it's not kind of surrendered, or it's not like a letting go of letting the energy of life move as it may.
I think that's very powerful. It ties back to even just the Buddha, what he said, that attachment is the root of all suffering. And so, like you said, that's a kind of a new perspective for me of what you've laid out with attachment to the ideal, and this polarity, you could say, is when you feel you're not meeting up to that ideal that the ego has imposed, and that's it in essence. That's the source of suffering. And there's a couple of points I just wanted to touch on here, just based on what came up. So first of all, I like this quote by Hawkins. I like both quotes. I like his one especially, because what you see with there's actually a map of the different levels as well, and I don't know if it's here, but people could look it up anyway. And what it shows is that with each level of energy, there's also an associated perception of God or the divine and its relationship to us. So I think, yeah, that's definitely the feeling here, that in that state of shame or guilt, it's like a feeling of abandonment. You feel, it's like I guess another way of looking at it is like the most purest, like concentrated sense of ego you can feel, in one sense, because it's the purest sense of separation, isolation, abandonment, which is kind of what the ego runs on.
It's also the book of Job speaks to this problem as well in the Bible. It's a very dramatic and powerful book, and it's a narrative around basically Job incarnates the ideal. He is righteous, like he is flourishing, he has a great family and wealth, and has been blessed by God in the beginning of the book, and then basically God, for some reason, makes deal with the devil, where the devil was like, yeah, but if you took all of these good things away from Job, he wouldn't maintain the faith. And so God kind of like takes all of these material things away from Job, and I think the book is a wrestling with this question. I think that's where we got onto some of the higher levels of consciousness, but it's like, I think that's the essential thing, is like, the feeling abandoned by God idea.
It sounds like I haven't read that. Like I've only read like certain passages of the Bible. It's something I want to look into more, and I have the Gnostic Gospels as well. I'm meaning to read that too, but yeah, it's kind of piqued my interest because it sounds what you've described, it sounds very relevant to just the human condition, that we have these attachments, and just like you said in the beginning, once we have those boxes ticked, there's a sense of satisfaction, fulfillment. But look what happens when they get taken away. That's when the real testing begins, and when we can drop into these lower states. And yeah, just like you, I've experienced the extremes as well, the lowest of the low, and I think everyone has really. But I think it would be good as well to reflect on these states as well. It's not just about, I think, what you feel internally, but also how it directs your perception of the world and how it directs your behavior towards others. And I think this is something David Hawkins points to as well, is that a lot of violence, a lot of sadism, very despicable acts, it's kind of rooted in this lowest energy field, that when we have I suppose we all carry some degree of guilt or shame inside, but when it's a very strong energy that we're very tied in with, then there's a tendency to project that out onto the world,
Yeah, when we're resisting it, basically, because that's what letting go is about, because it's about whether we resist or accept, basically. And I think, there's a lot of philosophical work and thought and study and just life consciousness work that goes into that, because it's not necessarily easy, but I think that is the crux of it, is that you're right, that we're all wounded, but what does that mean? That's kind of the thing, right? It's like, what does that mean? Like, does that mean I should wound other people? Does that mean I should just kill myself? Like, or does that mean we're all wounded and like we're all human, and like that's part of what it means to be human?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, I think just the small caveat I wanted to bring up there was just how, like, we talked about how suicide, it kind of, the energy turns in on itself, but it also can turn out onto the world, violent acts, projection, all of this. And this is a source for a lot of the trouble that's happening, is all of these emotions as a collective that aren't being let go of, as you said, when it's resisted. And another thing I wanted to mention was, it kind of came up in my mind earlier as you were talking, was like, so we all carry these lower states to a certain extent, unless you're somebody who's highly evolved. But if you feel these states, let's say for a period of time or like a bout in your life, that doesn't mean, at least how I see it, that you're calibrating at that level, that you're on a very low level. I feel like the majority of us, we're calibrating higher, and the majority are above, let's say 200, the level of courage. But that doesn't mean that we won't visit these states occasionally. It's not who you are, it's just a kind of a passing phase, and it's just something coming up to be processed, maybe old baggage to be released, so.
Yeah, and like, it's also a temptation. That's the thing, is like, unconsciousness is a temptation, and it's a temptation. Wouldn't it just be easier that my pain and my suffering and the tragedy of what's happened to me, wouldn't it just be easier that was someone else's fault? Like, it would be much easier than, Jung said that all coming to consciousness is painful, basically. And I think that is painful, to realize the deep of the wound of like what happened and like how I feel about it, and processing all that and working through it and expressing it and making it conscious, I think is a much more, it's a creative act, and that's the most sublime and destructive and difficult of acts to create, and I think to really truly express from the deep. And so, you know, it's easier. Easier to maintain that narrative in some ways. So I think there's a temptation idea as well there, and it's easier to put on the one ring than to throw it into the fires of Mount Doom, right? Like,
Yeah, that's a brilliant comparison, and I think it's a brilliant point as well. That there definitely is that temptation or that lure, and again, the One Ring and the Lord of the Rings is just perfect for this. You know, like I always say that the One Ring is a symbol for all of these lower states. You know, a large portion of them at least, and exactly the temptation, the allure of that. You know, that as you said, it's like part of us feels it's easier to be drawn into that, and it's easier to embrace victimhood. So I think
it's heavy, right?
Yeah, and I think it ties into kind of what we talked about earlier as well, like the attractor fields. Like it's basically one of these attractor fields in the metaphysical. It's very heavy, as you said. It's very powerful. It draws you in. There's an allure there to identify with these thoughts that are basically emanations from these states of being. You know, so the emotions create the thoughts, and then there's a tendency to identify with both, to be drawn in, and it's kind of like, I guess it ties in with the exponential idea as well. Like it's like a rocket taking off. In the beginning, it's got to use a lot of fuel to even get a little bit of lift. The emotions are pulling it down in that context. But after a while, as you release, it's like taking off faster and faster, you know. So
yeah, final little comment on that is, if you look at the character of Frodo through the Lord of the Rings, it is basically about him learning to let go, right? And like that, I think that is really the crux of our emotional life, is our willingness and capacity to let go, to surrender. That's what the Tao is. That's what the great Tao is, like the flow of life. And I think the whole idea of the One Ring is like that the density and the heaviness of that, and the temptation to succumb to that, and like his whole effort, his whole adventure is about letting something go, you know, letting something go and light, and thereby like lightening up, and that's all connected to this emotional stuff, because I think we hold things on, even if it's not physically hold them, we like spiritually or psychologically hold on to things. So yeah, I just put in a few images to kind of illustrate this, how we might feel like society or the ideal is judging us about how we've manifested our life.
yeah, good illustrations.
Yeah, they're quite beautiful. They're really good. So these are just covering this dense energy we're talking about here.
Yeah. That reminds me of the that one there with the cloaks. That reminds me of the Witch King, and you know those 9 kings from the Lord of the Rings.
Right, yeah.
Same thing, you know.
Yeah. And then this is from The Last Samurai. Is, you know, there's a whole ethic really about shame, you know, and how the samurai is dishonor. It's like dishonor, like, and therefore I should, like, the noble thing to do is to commit suicide. Yeah, I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying that there was a whole culture, the samurai culture, that took these things very, very seriously, you know, and you know, there's a logic to it. It makes sense from one perspective. I think, like, as we go through this, I think we'll understand why it's a limited perspective, but
yeah,
it has,
yeah.
So then the higher, like, and then the next, I mean, there's gradients to all of it, but I think the next kind of energy I wanted to explore was this idea of want or desire, and that's where you're not feeling sorry for yourself, you're not feeling burdened by guilt or shame, you're not feeling apathetic, you're not feeling like you've got no desire to do anything, and like, what is life worth, just sitting there in this meaningless and kind of like heavy energy. Instead, you're now, oh, I want that, I want success, I want this thing, I want that, like, and this moment of like, I want that thing, you're arousing more energy. And I think this is associated with either the sacral chakra or the solar bit. I think it's the sacral chakra is that kind of like base desire, You're just like, I want. And it's kind of like, you get this with children, I suppose. Like, I don't have any children, but like, you know, as children grow, like, I want this, I want that, I want, like, very basic. And I think we all have wants and desires. But yeah, this is what Hawkins has to say about it. So pathological forms of chronic wantingness are well known in society as an endless drive for relationships, sex, materialism, hoarding, addictions, and more. Due to its evolutionary origin, the ego develops the acquisitive function of getting, which is biologically necessary for survival. The source of satisfaction is therefore located as being out there. So I think we may as well just use Lord of the Rings as a narrative context for all of this, because the dark forces of Sauron are chronically wanting something out there. Like, that's what the Wraiths want, that's what Sauron wants, that's what the Orcs want, that's what Saruman wants, that's what everyone, all of the dark forces in the Lord of the Rings locate their highest ideal is a material object in the visible realm, in the visible dimension, and it's the One Ring of power, and they want to get it. And it's so it's a very interesting, like, illustration of the difference between good and evil in that narrative, because the evil is, and this is a Gnostic idea as well, is like evil is associated with materialism. It actually kind of keeps the soul bound, like imprisoned in a sense upon the kind of earthy physical plane, unable to, you know, ascend to higher knowledge of the truth. And so yeah, I think this is I think it's a higher level energy, a more positive level energy than the shame and the guilt, but there's still downsides to it.
There's still negativity there, I suppose. Like, it's still in the realm of force, isn't it? So it's got a little bit more power to it than shame and guilt, which is the absolute bottom. You know, it's close to death. Whereas this, it's kind of, I suppose, the first inkling towards positivity. You know, it starts with looking out into the world, seeking the self outside, seeking the self in the material realm. And I think, yeah, again, dark forces in the Lord of the Rings is a perfect analogy. You know, like how Sauron, he just wants nothing more than complete domination. I was listening to some videos recently just about the lore of Lord of the Rings, and it's incredibly deep and dense. But what I picked up was that Sauron, he felt that the original creation from Eru Ilúvatar was flawed. You know, that all these races of men, dwarves, that they could do as they liked, they had free will. So his whole ambition was about just complete control, domination. You know, that he wanted to create the world anew, in his own image. You know, through, I guess you could say, his ideal. And his ideal was one of just complete control and power. You know, and I think that's fundamentally what the ego is looking for, in a sense. You know, is just complete control of reality. And like you said, it does have more energy, but it's a very limited perspective too. It traps you in the world, you know, and there's always that lack there. And I think the lack is coming from not experiencing those higher levels, you know, where there's a greater connection, there's a greater integrity. So
Yeah, definitely. I think a really good film and a case study for this energy field is Requiem for a Dream. And so yeah, I would just recommend that. But that is about a group of heroin addicts, and basically it's a tragic film because you see the gradual kind of dissolution of their personalities, and they're consumed by want, basically. And it's the narrative lens of their personality is just this one thing, right? It's like heroin, like that's the nature of addiction. It can be whatever the thing is. doesn't matter as much. It's more the psychological context behind it. Is like there's just the lenses aren't a multiplicity, a broad, open perspective, which is higher consciousness, the flowering of the lotus of our consciousness. Instead, it's like this thing, like this one thing, and like give it to me now. And of course, that's like a very limiting way to live. It's a limiting perspective. It's not based in truth fundamentally, because it's just this splice of reality.
Yeah, it's like limiting the lens, isn't it? Like limiting what you can see and perceive. And another thing, I think that image there is just the perfect example. I think like how it's like when you associate with these lower states of energy, it even like what I intuit is it reflects in the physical appearance, you know. And I think there's an incredible example of this. It really stuck with me. I used to love video games when I was growing up, you know, teenager, all of that. And there was one I didn't really get into. I just played it through once, but the whole theme of that stuck with me. It was Fable. So I think it was Fable 2 or something specifically. And the idea was like...
Oh, I love Fable!
Yeah, like Fable 2. It was the only one I played, but basically every choice you made, it changed your physical appearance slightly, and you could end up becoming like this angelic being, or you could end up becoming this like devil, like horned devil. And I thought that was like, again, like you talked about earlier, back then for me when I was a teenager, it was like an implicit understanding. But as I kind of reflected on these later, it became more explicit, where I thought, wow, you know, that was actually very powerful. It's showing something powerful there, that like what we associate with, even how we behave, you know, again, it's this concept of karma, I guess, as well. It literally reflects in who we become. And that's even on a very crude physical level, I think, like it changes our appearance, you know. So I think you can see that with this addiction as well.
Yeah, definitely leaves an imprint on our aura. I think our intents and desires. And so then like pride is associated to that too. Essentially, is like basically pride is like I want, and the thing is like this is all documented in the temptation of Christ as well, because basically Christ is tempted in the desert by hedonism, like pleasure, basically, like I want like just pleasure, and then he's tempted by the kingdoms of the world, and so it's like I want material success. And then the highest temptation is like I think the devil challenges him to jump from a tower or something and get the angels to break his fall. So yeah, the third greatest temptation is pride, and pride is like a kind of more abstract level of want, but it's kind of like wanting to look a certain way. It's wanting to look a certain way in your own mind. That it's like, you know, an attractive identity, an attractive image of like who I am. And it's so subtle, because like the thing is to remember, I think, is with the surrender idea, the bigger picture is that we transform through many personalities. Like, you know, the 7-year-old me, the 13-year-old me, the 20-year-old me, like all of these different splices of my identity have radically transformed through my life. But what pride is, as I understand it, is like the 7-year-old me, or whatever that age fragment, that identity complex being like, hey, I want to grab absolute control of the reins of this personality and say like, we're this way, and like there's this strong attachment to it, and anyone or anything or any comment or anything that kind of doesn't gel with that narrative is denied, rejected, or attacked. And I think that's part of the tyrannical mindset of communist ideology, or just tyrannical perspectives in general, is exactly that. It's pride. It's like, I know what I want, and nothing else is gonna... I know what I want and who I am, and I'm attached to that. I'm very attached to that. I'm hoarding that, essentially. And if anyone tries to mess with that, I'm going to be very hostile about that. And I think like that's my understanding of pride, at least. And I think it comes to an image.
I think that's a really good like overview of the state, you know, and I think what you brought up as well about tyrannies is interesting, because I think pride can tie in with concepts as well, like nationalism, you know, like, and it can almost be seen as a good thing, you know. It's like, you know, nationalistic pride, or there's this collective identity as well, and on some level it is higher, like it's a lot higher than, let's say, shame and what we've covered, you know, but it is ultimately a force-based state as well, you know. It's devoid of love, and I think it's interesting as well because you can have different perspectives, like everything can be viewed through different levels of energy. So one can be proud of their ethnicity, and that can lead to division, you know, it can lead to strife and conflict, and it's essentially devoid of love. But then one can, for example, love the place they grew up, they can love their locality, they can even love, I don't know, a concept like a country. It's two different perspectives, you know. So I definitely see that. And yeah, I suppose that's the other point, is like society to a large extent, and David Hawkins, he talks about this, is that society is driven by pride to a great degree, you know, that pride has come to be seen almost as a positive, you know, which is really a distortion of truth, you know, that pride is seen as something to live up to, that you'd be proud of your profession, you'd be proud of your ethnicity, you'd be proud of, you know, where you grew up. And I find that interesting, that that's where a lot of society has been for a long time, is just at the threshold of breaking into these higher levels, you know. And yeah.
Well, it is. Yeah, it's all a progression, right? It's because like it's a film that comes to mind with this is This Is England. I haven't actually seen that film in like a very long time, but the basic idea is that like a disorganized, chaotic personality, like those lower energies we were talking about, like it cries out for order and coherence and structure, and it's like it's yearning for it, like just this meaningless existence. It's just like, give me something. And then there's, oh, this is what you can, and it's like this identity, and like this identity is offered to you, and like, here's how you can identify. And that's awesome. That's really positive. Like, it's a positive development from pure chaos.
Yeah.
But it's yeah, I don't think it's the ultimate goal of individual development. I think you see it in adolescence and moving into like early 20s as well. Like, it's a struggle for identity, coming from like this disorientation. Like, I need an identity, like I need a sense of identity. But then the thing is, I think what pride is, the essence of pride is basically, again, like Gollum, it's like, it's the attachment to the identity. It's not that the identity in itself is a bad thing. It's just that identities are always transforming. We're always like, we are not the same people we were 6 months ago. And so like, because of that fact, the attachment energy around the identity is gonna basically block the flow of life.
Dow or something. It's not moving with the dough. But I just want to, I know it's another rabbit hole, I don't want to go too much into it, but yeah, just touching on what you said about that example, This Is England, I think that's a perfect example. I haven't seen it either, but I just know the gist of what it's about. And what came up for me was, I can't remember the guy who originated the idea. Maybe I'll be able to put it in the comment or the video after, but it's like, the concept is like 4 stages of spiritual growth. And it's exactly what you talked about. So like, yeah, the first stage is like chaotic. And then the second stage is all about being provided with order by an institution. You know, a lot of people, they turn to the church, and that's where, so stage 2 is basically the fundamentalist stage as well, where it's like the imagination isn't cultivated. It's all about interpreting scripture in that context, word for word, you know, or just as you said, it's about joining like a political group or some movement, you know, and it's about a collective identity. And then I think from what I remember, after that comes like stage 3. It's about, you break away from those institutions, or you kind of see them from a different light. You know, in the context of religion, it would be, let's say, the atheist materialist phase, where one like identifies with science. And I went through that phase myself, and then after a while it breaks into like stage 4, which is kind of the mystical interpretation, you know, where it comes full circle. Like you might go back to religion, but it's from through a different lens or a different context, you know, like Gnosticism will be one example. So yeah, I guess it just all ties together really, you know, it's just another framework to look at it through.
Yeah, I love it.
Before we move on there, I'm just going to take a bathroom break so I can like pause the recording, and we'll be back in a second. Like if you want to get water as well, or you know.
Cool, man.
I just resumed the recording there anyway. So whenever you're ready.
Cool. So what have we got with pride? Yeah, we'll finish off with the pride edit. So pride. Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of this in what we're talking, but we'll finish off the slides. So Hawkins says that pride is defensive and vulnerable because it is dependent upon external conditions, without which it can suddenly revert back to a lower level. The inflated ego is vulnerable to attack. Pride remains weak because it can be knocked off its pedestal back to shame. Yeah, I think this is, yeah, we've stressed it already, but like this interrelationship between shame and pride. And Jung talked about inflation, and it's kind of like the ego getting blown up like a balloon, and it's basically the sense of confidence you get when you're successful in a particular domain, which is natural and important. But when we become attached to that success, then we become vulnerable, and that's the ancient Greek myth of hubris. And the association of Lucifer with pride. It's a really ancient idea that, you know, the attachment to our image or the attachment to our inflated sense of empowerment is our greatest downfall, because that balloon can also always be popped, you know, and we kind of fall back down.
I suppose it's the idea as well. I think Eckhart Tolle talks about this, of how the ego has it the opposite way around. You know, the ego thinks that putting up a strong front gives one strength, whereas in actuality, it's letting go and surrender and vulnerability and openness is the strong position, because it can't be attacked, it can't be dethroned, you know. And I think if you want to look at it from the lens of Taoism, it's about how the river flows to the lowest point, all the water gathers to the lowest point, you know. And it's this Bible quote as well of, again, it ties in with the Lord of the Rings. I was looking at this clip of, you know, when Aragorn, he's crowned king and he's with, I can't remember, Arwen, I think is her name, the elven woman. And there's a huge ceremony, you know, everybody's cheering, he sings a song. He goes down through the crowds and he sees the 4 hobbits, you know, and they're, I suppose, from one perspective, they're the embodiment of innocence and humility, you know, and they bow to the king, and he says, "My friends, you bow to no one," you know. So for me, that really resonates with this Bible passage of, I don't know word for word, but like Jesus said that, you know, those who humble themselves will be exalted, and those who exalt themselves will be humbled. So it's this dynamic, you know. Pride, if you want to, I just want to give a lot of examples here. So if you want to look at Reality Transurfing, that book I talked about as well, he brings up this concept of excess potential, how basically the universe seeks to address balance in all circumstances. So when one becomes proud, that creates like an excess potential of energy that the universe then seeks to address by knocking it down.
Interesting. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Different
perspectives on pride, you know, and I think looking at all of that, you can get a strong context for what it is. And yeah, I just want to mention as well that, like, I guess we'll get to this, but like, this is the threshold from negative into positive, you know. And we talked about earlier, like the second coming of Christ. You mentioned that, and I think that's a really interesting point, like, because Dr. Hawkins, he talked about this as well, that like the second coming of Christ, and I really love this perspective. It's like, it's not about Jesus Christ, and you mentioned this earlier as well, like it's not about Jesus Christ coming back to earth as a physical human, you know, which is how the fundamentalists, you know, stage 2, that's how they interpret it. But it's about a field of energy, and it's about, he says, humanity crossing this threshold from predominantly negative state into a predominantly positive state, even if it's just the lowest level of positivity. We've already crossed that threshold. Hawkins suggested in the 1980s that humanity collectively went up to the level of courage for the first time, you know, so that's a very inspiring development as well, you know, that we're kind of in this upward spiral now, just beginning it.
Yeah. Well, I think that was associated as well with the historical developments of the 20th century. Like around the late 80s is when the Soviet Union collapsed, and like that ideology is all, the attractor field behind it was like pride, basically. It's like so I think that's really significant. But yeah, there's lots of developments that make that the case, but I think you're completely right. You know, and I think as well as like the everyone, more and more people having a taste of what material success looks like because of the success of our economy and because of the flourishing of like free values. Everyone's very quickly getting a taste for that and realizing like that's not what life's about. And I think Gary Vaynerchuk is an entrepreneur who, his whole message is really about that. Really, is about like how actually have the courage to do what you want and be who you want to be, regardless of how much money or what you think you should be doing at this phase in life. And it's really interesting watching Gary Vaynerchuk kind of speak his message, because he is basically promoting a lot of traditional Christian values like humility and patience and diligence and like stuff like that. And yeah, that gives me a lot of hope and encouragement, because it's a new generation, a new paradigm of entrepreneurship, and it's really grounded in truth. It's grounded in, you know, what's real. Don't try and, you know, pridefully be this image of like who, you know, don't build your career on that, and build it on rock, and build it on the rock of like who you actually are and what you're going to do.
That's an incredible point. That's a new perspective. Like, that was something I kind of knew inside, but it's like you've made it explicit. So yeah, it's like, you know, we're sent down certain paths, and there's a lot of pride vested in that, you know, pride of family, pride of society. But it's like going against that grain. It's daunting, but it, like you said, there's a strong element of truth there. You know, it's coming from a higher place. It's all about, you know, like the Greeks called it the muses. You know, listening to these divine inspirations within that are kind of guiding you towards something, and you don't really know what it is, but it's just, it feels more real. It feels more authentic, and there's kind of more power in that. You know.
Oh yeah, 100%. I love that. I love the Greek image of the muses. It's a beautiful image. So yeah, just to wrap up on pride. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. No, this isn't Jekyll and Hyde, but that is one of them. This is the Picture of Dorian Gray. That's an amazing book. I really recommend it. Oscar Wilde.
I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, I remember. Yeah, reading it many years back, but it's a drama, I would say, that covers a lot of this, and it covers like this Jungian idea of the shadow self, and like the idea of the picture of Dorian Gray is like Dorian Gray is this like basically nihilistic, hedonistic kind of character, and it's this like handsome kind of guy here who's looking, and then he has this portrait done of him, this painting, and within that is imbued all like the sins and all the darkness and all the shame and the guilt that he would have held on to, but instead it's like, you know, put in this portrait, and it just gets darker and darker.
Yeah.
And I thought this was an interesting image to cover a lot of the points we've talked about. how there's this kind of, the more we buoy up our pride, the more we kind of necessarily ignore our shadowy, shameful elements, and that tension is unhealthy. Basically, it's unbalanced, because this just gets darker and darker. And as Jung said, if the unconscious is not made conscious, it will rule your life, and you'll call it fate. So what will happen is, like, the ping will come back and the shadow will kind of like overtake. But
Yeah, I think that's like, I haven't read it, like I said, but just from what I pick up, it seems like perfect analogy. You know, like how he's this very prideful individual, it seems, and then, like you said as well, there's also the connection of the shadow building in the portrait. You know, so just like you said, it's like, as we associate with that state, we're not acknowledging what's those lower, even lower states as well, that are bubbling up, you know, and that can rip us back down to, let's say, shame, you know.
100%, yeah. What's it? It's from Snow White, I think, the Evil Queen. Mirror, mirror on the wall.
Oh yeah.
This is is
300,
from 300, yeah. The God King, and this is from
American Psycho, Patrick Bateman.
American Psycho, yeah. Well, he's the incarnation of pride, right? Like, he really is. You know, successful, handsome, in love with his image. I love the scene of, like, the business cards.
Oh, yeah.
And the slight nuanced imperfections in the business cards, and the effect that has on his personality. You know, like, it's comical, but like that film, I think, is a great illustration of these ideas.
And it's in all of us as well. Like, I mean, it is, because it is funny, that scene, but I think it's funny because we understand that that's in us, like that pettiness, you know, that it's just perfectly illustrated. We've all had that pang, you know, where something doesn't go right for us or whatever, and we see maybe something else is going well for someone else, and then there's like a pang of it, you know. So it's just human condition, you know. Like, that's why it's funny, because we all see it in ourselves, you know.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, cool. So, and as you rightly said, I think for Hawkins, the shift from pride to courage is a significant energetic shift for him, because that's the point when the negative energy starts to become positive. And yeah, I mean, let's go a little bit into this courage idea, because Jung, the central Jungian idea, a central Jungian idea, is the idea that psychological health is predicated upon the incarnation and the embodiment of the myth of the hero. And the hero is centrally a courageous figure, and a figure who is willingly voyaging into the unknown, and is willingly transcending an existing paradigm, like Bilbo Baggins with his comfort and his pantry, and he's called onto the lonely mountain, and, you know, he's got an existing paradigm. It's working quite well. He's well-to-do. He's good, and there's that pride and that comfort. But it's just that you know, the courage to step outside your front door and go on an adventure is part of the hero image.
The hero's journey, I suppose, really, isn't it? Like the refusal of the call, and then they finally agree. There's that courage, and it goes from there, you know.
Yeah, and it comes to the point of whether you explore novelty or not. Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning is an amazing book which illustrates these ideas, like, in amazing depth. And he talks about basically that, you know, like when Bilbo Baggins has got these dwarves in his house and Gandalf shows up and they're all saying, look, we've lost our kingdom, we need to go and redeem our kingdom, and we need to go, you know, slay a dragon. You know, that's some novelty, and that's a challenge to his existing paradigm. And the thing is he has a choice, and he almost doesn't go on the quest. I think he wakes up late or something, and you have a choice to sweep that under the rug, Like, you have a choice to sweep novelty and the unknown under the rug, but what happens is, like we just said, is this build-up of shadow energy. Is like what happens when you take that conscious attitude in your ego of like sweep it under the rug, then it builds up in the unconscious and will play itself out eventually. So it's not very wise to do that, but we do have a choice to take that attitude. And essentially, I think that's basically what sin means is you know, that's why Lucifer is the spirit of deceit, because deceit, the psychological process of deceit, is the process of, oh, I just won't look at that. I'll sweep these dwarves and this call to adventure under the rug, and I won't look at that. But yeah, I don't. It's not good.
It's a very like comforting, insidious kind of psychological process, and it's like it's bit by bit, and there's a choice at every moment, and it can be very comforting to just, as you said, turn away from novelty, turn away from breaking out of your comfort zone. But yeah, exactly like you said, it's like it builds up. And I was only reading a quote there earlier today, like just random image. It says something like, not following this intuition, this guidance, or this call to adventure is like a slow suicide. And it really correlates with that book, The Picture of Dorian Gray. You know, the image building up. It's more, it's darker, it's uglier, it's developing a shadow. You know, we have that choice. Do we build up that shadow, or do we take the risk, the call to adventure? And there are, as we talked about at the beginning of the call, there's like doubts and fears with that. But I think the juice is worth the squeeze, you know, in terms of the soul's development and who you become, you know, living on the edge kind of.
Yeah, 100%. You know, life's an adventure, and I think courage is the fundamental value that's going to guide us through that adventure. So here's what Hawkins had to say about it. He says, courage implies the willingness to try new things and deal with changes and challenges and the challenges of life. At this level of empowerment, one is able to cope with and effectively handle the opportunities of life. The energy to learn new job skills is available. Growth and education become attainable goals. There's a capacity to face fears or character defects and to grow despite them. Anxiety does not cripple endeavour. People at this level put back into the world as much energy as they take. This is where productivity begins. I really like that. It's a great summary. And I think this is associated with, you know, the world of work, you know, learning and development, taking on new challenges, taking on new relationships, taking on new projects, like, yeah, just trying anything new, really. And as you say, I think that energetic shift between pride and courage does turn on this idea of humility, the virtue of humility, because humility is, well, it's really well dramatized in Lord of the Rings again, because the alchemists had this phrase. They said the philosopher's stone, you'll find it where you're least likely to look, which is like just such an interesting idea in alchemy. Is like they said our stone is the stone of little worth, and you know, it is about the world. You'll find it anywhere, but no one can see it. And like, that's kind of like Frodo Baggins at that meeting in Rivendell, where there's all these great prideful, like the dwarves, the elves, like the what's Boromir's, like Gondor, like all of these noble kingdoms, like they're like, okay, like what are we going to do about the destruction of this One Ring? And then Frodo is you know, the thing of little worth, so to speak, or like little consideration, or like no one would think that a hobbit, you know, like who is this? Like no one would even consider that, and he's like, okay, I'll take it. And like, that's a really powerful moment, and it is a humility, and a kind of, look, I don't know, I'm not this like noble person, but like, look, this has come to me, this is the call, and I'll pursue that call. It's really where we're able to step outside that pride narrative or that image of ourselves as a certain way, and instead just, you know, lower our image of ourselves and say, look, okay, let me follow this call.
Yeah, there's a really strong dynamic between courage and pride, isn't there? Like, just, I suppose it makes sense. You look at this map, how they're one after the other, you know, like, it's almost like a polarity in itself, you know, like we talked about pride and shame, but also like pride and courage, you know, like, because pride, in a sense, it's like an absence of courage from one perspective, you know, because pride is like, you know, I have all the answers. Can you still hear me, by the way? Because I think my screen is frozen. Okay, yeah. Yeah, but like pride is like, you know, I have it all figured out, and it's inflated, you know, whereas courage, it's like the willingness to accept that you don't know as well. It's the willingness to accept you don't have all the answers or the solutions, and things mightn't work out, but you're willing to face the consequences and just take action, you know. So I think there's a polarity there as well. And I love the comparison you made as well of the fellowship, you know, how Frodo and the hobbits, they are seen as the ones of least worth, but they go on to do some of the greatest deeds out of that fellowship, you know. So it's another good symbol.
Yeah, 100%. And it's a very interesting thing to elucidate as well, because courage, I think you typically think of it as like a sword swinging hero running into battle. And you know, it is that, but it's also fundamentally an attitude of I don't know, and like an attitude of humility, or an attitude of, you know, I don't know if I'm prepared for this, but I'm gonna try anyway. And I think that really is how learning occurs. So I think philosophically it's very important too, because you can't learn new things unless you're intellectually courageous, so to speak, to say, actually, what do I know? And let me just be open to what this person is saying.
Yeah. How do you feel about this call? Do you want to do it all in one, or do you want to divide it in two? I'm just conscious of time as well, you know, because it's like it's 8 o'clock now.
Yeah, I don't mind. Do you want to wrap it up? I'm basically I'm good. I'm good to keep going, but it has been a while. So if you don't want to look, I'm happy to.
So it will go through all the emotions up until love, peace, enlightenment, is it?
There's, I think, like, there's not that much more. Oh, can you see this?
Yeah.
There's reason, which is the next level, which is like intellect, and then there's basically love, joy, and imagination, and we can tie it up there. So
Okay.
it's nearly done.
All right, fair enough. I'd say we'll keep going, but yeah, we won't go down any big rabbit holes. We just focus on this.
Yeah, I think we're both. We can both talk a lot about like different things, can't we? Like,
there's so many ideas to tie in with it, you know. So
100%.
I think it's good, you know, because it does provide like additional context and stuff. So yeah, I think while we're at it, we might as well just go to the very end, you know. So
yeah, cool. Yeah, so I've got some images in here for courage. So like Messi in football being an embodiment of that, you know, an ordered, yeah, just like going into the unknown, going into chaos, working through that, facing that head on, and achieving victory. Conor McGregor as well. You know, Michael Phelps. Like, so in the world of sport and athletics, I think courage is a really important value. I think this is like a job interview image as well. Like, again, like associated to just humility of like I think, yeah, that's the feeling I've had in job interviews, is just like, you know, it's like it's a courageous act. It's like, you know, I don't know, like these people are going to judge me, but like I'm going to go there anywhere and just try this out. Yeah, like Gladiator, Last Samurai, this is Pan's Labyrinth, loads of images from film where basically all of these are incarnating what Jung called the image of the hero. So this is the classic St. George's myth. And yeah, the way I see it is like Messi, Conor McGregor, Michael Phelps, like and like all of those people, and then us in our individual lives, like we're all incarnating that image of the hero when we do something like outside our comfort zone. It's a very powerful process, facing the unknown.
It's the beginning of power, really, isn't it? Like it's when you're starting to get real power coming through. It's the beginning of it, and yeah, it's just fundamental, really. It's just the beginning of positivity and integrity. Is just the willingness to take risks and to face into the unknown, you know.
Because then you find out what you're capable of, right? Through challenge. Like challenge is actually what calls out what you're capable of.
And I suppose tying in with the negative emotions as well, like this ties in with the process of letting go that David Hawkins talks about in one of his books, you know, that it's also like courage, like when we see courage depicted in film, you know, like you showed Harry Potter, there's Lord of the Rings, like these are very explicit forms of courage, but courage can be just something so simple and internal as well, like the courage to sit with yourself, not allow yourself to be distracted, to actually sit with your emotions, to sit with these lower energies. Like let's say you're going through a bout of like guilt, or you're going through a bout of anger, just to sit down with that and to go into it, to face it fully. It's like facing the dragon, you know, that archetype, and that's courage as well, you know.
That's a very important point, yeah. Has more subtle forms, and especially with the inner life, yeah, focusing on how you feel and questioning what you believe as well. Like I think all of those things are internal forms of courage. And then reason is a higher level than courage, and what this means to me is organizing your life according to certain you know, concepts and principles of like how you should organize your life. Like, so I don't know, like you value health and therefore you should go on runs and exercise and diet and stuff. Like, now, do we always do that? No. Does it require discipline to do that? Yes. But should we do that? Like, yeah, like, and that's kind of like rationality is like, okay, like this is how I should order my life, and let's try and bring my life into accordance with that, and also bring society into accordance with that. Now, there's huge dangers to that, but there's also huge positives to that. So, but I think that's the level of consciousness of reason. I think humanity's really had that watershed moment since the Enlightenment, really, where religious dogma was challenged for maybe the first time, for the first time in Europe, and what I think we're living with the cultural heritage of that in many ways, you know, a rational outlook on life. And I mean, there's a lot to be said about rationality. I mean, it is built into our society. Our computers are rational systems, you know, the Big Bang narrative and the scientific materialist narrative in general is, you know, implicitly accepted as the prevailing paradigm of knowledge, the prevailing philosophy, the prevailing way to look at the world. And the thing about it is that it does produce results, obviously. Like it's that, you know, we do implicitly accept a lot of scientific assumptions because we use computers, because we're doing this. Like, you know what I mean? Like we can't do a Zoom call without implicitly accepting certain rational assumptions.
The level of consciousness, really, isn't it? It's like a perspective, and I guess it comes back to how every level is true to an extent, you know, like every level is true from that level in a way. Like when you're experiencing that, that's a whole model of reality, and it makes perfect sense, but if each level is slightly less limited than the one before it, and slightly more limited than the one that comes beyond it. And I think there's two things I want to touch on. Like, first off, yeah, like reason is so prevalent in society, and it's like, just like pride as well, that society is run a lot on that. That is prevalent and that's almost looked up to. Reason is there as well, and I think that almost balances out the pride to a certain extent, that there's a lot of rationality, there's a lot of reason, that's calibrating in the level of the 400s according to the Hawkins scale. And yeah, like you said, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, like all these things. Second point is, I think all of this as well, it correlates with that map of the 4 stages of spirituality. So I'm definitely going to link that somewhere, with this video once I find it. But basically, how I see it is like reason and rationality and logic and all of that. That correlates with stage 3. So, just as you said, it's a stage of kind of materialistic worldview, generally atheism. It turns away from God in a dogmatic sense, which is a good progression, I think, but it's not the final stage, at least according to this perspective. And
well, it's also associated with the throat chakra, I think, is that is what's like kind of articulate, like is what's not mystical, but is articulate and explainable. I think that's the level of consciousness around it, is like, a rational argument, a rational theory. I can explain it to you, all of that. And that's super, super powerful to have that tool. And it's a real evolution, but it's not the whole picture. And it has a proclivity to tend like it is the whole picture. Like, it has an internal logic that wants to.
You see that with science as well. It's like, it's almost like when reason or rationality becomes colored with pride, and you see that with scientific dogma, like Richard Dawkins, it becomes very calcified, like the science, it loses humility. And I guess you can tie this in with the levels of energy as well. Like science, to a great extent, it has lost humility, and humility ties in with courage. I guess the courage on a subtle level to explore new ideas, to be open-minded to new perspectives. You see that with scientists like Rupert Sheldrake, how they're exploring these radical ideas, and that is very courageous. But then you see how the scientific community ostracizes them, it becomes very stuck in its ways. So that's pride, I guess, mixed with reason in a way. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, totally. There's a film called this image here is from a film called The Man Who Knew Infinity, which I really recommend to anyone to watch. And it's such a beautiful illustration of this concept, is that this is in Cambridge University, and basically here you've got a guy, this is based on a true story, and it's an Indian guy called Ramanujan, and it's an amazing story, but Ramanujan is the guy on the right. He's got no training in mathematics, but he's basically just highly intuitive, and he's like basically a poor Indian person who's basically scrawling basically mathematical proofs on, he just sees a number, he sees in mathematics, and he actually thinks that it's his like a Hindu deity, a goddess, is actually kind of like, as you said, like the muse is like telling him these proofs. And the film's a beautiful exploration of this, because he basically just it's so funny, like he comes in and gives these proofs and like literally changes mathematics, like solves these incredible mathematical problems. And the establishment at Cambridge are like, cool that you've just like proved that, but can you like prove that? Like, do you know what I mean? Like they actually say like part of the dogma in a way is like, yeah, but how did you arrive at that conclusion? Can you prove it? Can you show me in a sequential analysis how you arrived X, Y, and Z to there? And he's like, no, but like I know it is the case. And they're like, yeah, but okay, like it is the case. Like fair enough, you're changing mathematics, but you know, you prove it. And so it's yeah, I thought it was a beautiful illustration of this tension between the intuitive mind and the rational mind. Yeah.
Man, that's massive, that point that you made. Like I see that as well, of how there's almost, it comes back to the brain as well, you know, left brain versus right brain. Like left brain is like the rational, the logical side. Right brain tends to be more intuitive and artistic, creative, these kind of things. It works through hunches, you know, and it works through faith in a way, whereas the left brain is all about proof. And you see that really showing up, I think, with the intersection with like the scientific community, as this film shows. I haven't seen it, but it seems to, like the scientific community with mystical or spiritual side of things. And what you see is like exactly that. There's like a tension, you know, that I think those mired in rationality, or left brain thinking, they can be very distrusting of intuitive thinkers and intuitive thinking in general. There's a kind of a hostility there. And
it's because paradox denies the, it's like there's a yeah, it's because like one of the logical, like logic itself is built on the assumption that a thing can't be a thing and not a thing. And the thing is that like the irrational intuitive mind is a paradox generator, perceiver kind of thing, you know, like you know, the image of Christ is judgment and mercy, right? Like they're two like polarities, like these opposites. And like yeah, I think, you know, I think higher truth is fundamentally paradoxical. It contains, the image of the whole contains opposite parts, and to see that you need a third eye. And I think that third eye is real, and I don't think it's a coincidence it's called the third eye too, because it means it unites the two into a three. And I think that's what intuition actually is. Whereas logic is just the one and the two. If you know what I mean, it's seeing with the two bodily eyes instead of the third intuitive eye. Like, because it's like, is this thing a thing or is this thing not a thing? That's like what logic says. And like, there's so much value in it, because like, you know, that's a helpful and a reasonable distinction to make, and we've come a long way through making it. In fact, computer is binary logic, right? Is noughts and ones. Like, is it a thing or is it not a thing? Like that, literally this whole computer thing we're doing right now is built on that one logical predicate. So like, it's cool and it's powerful and it's like important, but the thing is like, it gets to the point where it's like, does not compute is a thing and is not a thing at the same time.
Like, very,
you know
it becomes very stuck in its ways, like calcified, like we were saying, you know. And I think there is a breakthrough there, and there are higher levels to be reached, and it ties in with the intuition, it ties in with the right side of the brain. And I think there's some interesting books on this. Like, one that I read is Return to the Brain of Eden. It talks about the bicamerality of the mind, like there's two sides. It also referenced one that I think you read, because I saw you posting about it before. It was like the emissary and his messenger, or something about the brain.
The master and his emissary, yeah.
Master and his emissary. Yeah, like the two-sidedness of the brain. And maybe you'd like to talk about the master and his emissary, but like what I got from Return to the Brain of Eden was that there's also possibly an evolutionary aspect to this, that, you know, again, coming back to like symbolism, allegory, mythology, there's these archetypes of like the Garden of Eden, you know, the fall of mankind. And what Return to the Brain of Eden talks about is that in the past, far back in humanity's evolution, that the brain was more coherent, you know, there was more unity between the left and the right, the intuition and the logic. But that due to evolutionary changes, you know, there was climatic catastrophes, or diet shifted, that's what they suggest, that it led to a dysfunctioning, and this is what gave rise to the ego, which I'm not saying this is necessarily the case, but I think it's very interesting, and it seems to make a lot of sense that it ties in with, you know, these archetypes, the Garden of Eden, the fall of mankind, and basically that humanity's gone on this journey where the ego has developed, and I suppose the separation of the intuition, the logic, and it's about reunifying that, like you said, you know, the third eye, it's about the synthesis of the two, you know. So I think that's where we're headed, hopefully, at least.
Yeah, no, I that's an important point, and I think I thought a lot about that. It's basically like that. Yeah, it's like in the beginning. Well, if you think of our ancestors, like they didn't even have a differentiated concept of self. Like they were just literally nature, because we are literally nature. Like, so you're in, you know, so you're in the forest hunting, and you've eaten a few psychedelic mushrooms. Like the whole world is just a unity, and but but there isn't this differentiated consciousness, which is what the left hemisphere does. Like our ability to articulate this now is because we've got this, we've inherited from our ancestors a incredibly differentiated categorical system, which is this language, like the English language. Like it's based on separation, it's based on differentiation, and so that's like a really powerful thing too, you know, because it's like this gets into really mystical territory, but I mean it's all been a mystical territory, but like but like it's kind of like my intuition on it is like the idea is that it's kind of like for God to become incarnate, it needs to become specific, and that's why we're incarnated in temporal, spatial and material temporal limits, and so one of the limits is category and logic and specificity, and all of those things make it very pointed and very specific. That's like what a computer algorithm is, and it's highly specialized. But that's what makes things manifest in a way. It makes them become clear and discernible and visible out of the implicit unified manifold. And so that's really cool. That's a really positive thing. But then, as you say, like there's a shadow side to it, which is this sense of separation and egoic values and our disconnection from nature. And so how powerful would it be to unify a highly specialized and differentiated understanding of the world with the holistic truth of the master? And so that's what the right hemisphere is about, is like the truth is this imaginative intuition, and then there's a specialized understanding which is like its servant, which is like left hemisphere. But McGilchrist thinks it's been inverted in our society, where like you've got technological values here but the imagistics here. And what I like to remind everyone of for this stuff is like that Newton, like I keep telling the story, but like Newton was an alchemist. Like modern science was born out of occult mysticism. Like this story isn't told by scientists or by modern rationalists, but like John Maynard Keynes purchased Newton's works on alchemy. 80% of his mental effort was devoted to the pursuit of the philosopher's stone. And guess who penetrated the mysteries of light? And guess who discerned the great laws of the cosmos? It was the guy seeking the philosopher's stone. Quite a coincidence. But like there's this whole like mystical and occult tradition, and really I think a lot of like rationality has turned its back on that and says, oh no, we didn't come from alchemy, we didn't come from like, astrology and all of that. But like nah, like we did. Like that's how it evolved, and that's how all thought evolves, is rationality emerges out of the irrational.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I agree with that. Yeah,
I'm just going to quickly charge my laptop.
All right. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but I forgot about it. Oh yeah, I think it was. I think that journey is like a natural progression, though. That I think could be wrong, but my intuition says that that's how it's meant to unfold. If you take any given planet or the evolution that happens. It's like there's a journey into separation, there's a journey into ego, and that's like taken to the fullest extent possible. And Charles Eisenstein, he's one of my favorite authors. Like, I talk about him a lot. He takes this whole perspective, that it's a journey. What humanity has gone through is like a journey into separation, like developing the ego, or you could say from one perspective, the left hemisphere to the fullest extent possible, like logic, reason, all of that, separation. But that carries within itself the seed of like a breakthrough into something greater, which is like the right hemisphere being reintegrated, like intuition, introspection, interconnection of everything, interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls it, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And I think, it's just a natural progression. Like, there is a phase of separation, but then it gets unified again, the synthesis that we talked about. And I think that's where it's headed.
Yeah, the alchemical dictum was dissolve and coagulate, solve et coagula, which was the whole process of the alchemical work, and which basically speaks to that narrative of separation and unity, decomposition and dissolution, and then rebirth. And I think that is the process of alchemy. And also, if you think of the proliferation of liberal values in our society, the idea that the individual is important and that we do have important, unique perspectives, like what you're doing with your channel, what I'm doing with mine, and what any artist is doing with their art, is a veneration of separation in a way, like in the sense of individuality. And I think that's a glorious thing, and that's a glorious thing. And so then to come back into unity from a place of differentiation, conscious differentiation, is a beautiful kind of redemptive image, I think.
Definitely, yeah. Great point.
So this is a level of consciousness I think we've covered quite well, is this idea of rationality and the intellect. And I think it's very prevalent in our society. And then this section 3 is surrender. And we've covered these themes too. And I think we're kind of hitting on it now, is like, it's really just an openness to that which transcends our existing paradigms, and an openness to possibility. Because there is infinite information out there, and what we know is just this little drop in that ocean. And so I think imagination is the bridge or the portal to other fields of information and possibility. And like the imagination, or the third eye, or the intuitive eye, can be closed in purely rationally minded people, like we were talking about. And I think that's part of like the ideology of science. I think it's built into the implicit assumptions of science. And while science is important, I think it needs to be open to the imagination, which is why I keep emphasizing that Newton was an alchemist, because it's a really uncomfortable fact for someone who's thoroughly in that kind of scientific paradigm. But it is a fact, it is a reality.
I think like a lot of the great contributors to just science and development were like mystical. Like, another great example is Nikola Tesla, like his contributions to physics and electricity, and he was like just incredibly mystical and intuitive, And
Einstein thought in music. He thought in music. That's what he said. How his theories came to him.
Yeah.
And Pythagoras as well.
It kind of just gets brushed under the rug, Like, it's kind of an inconvenient truth that those mired in the rational side of things, they don't want to acknowledge that, but it's definitely there. And I feel like science is inevitably going to have a breakthrough. I think like it is going to break out of this like stuckness, this excessive logic and rationality. I think, there's even that quote by Nikola Tesla. It's like, the day that science starts to study non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in a decade than it did in all of its existence, And it's exactly this, that when science kind of humbles itself, which I think it's going to start doing, it's going to open up to these alternative ideas, and then it's going to be just an explosion of growth and insights, and going to be a breakthrough on an energy level into this, what you're talking about here, surrender, like the higher states like gratitude, love, imagination. I think that's what's needed more than anything, and I think that's where it's headed ultimately.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely underway, and I think it's because they're more powerful energies, and it's you just can't argue with the facts. I think the truth prevails, as we said, like
Yeah,
so yeah, it's the classic Einstein one, like imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, imagination encircles the world. And like, yeah, so I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think I think we've covered it a lot there. Like, I think like the idea like that we intuit truths, the idea like we can directly intuit truths and directly intuit archetypal forms and beauty and goodness. This idea was strongly in the minds of the ancients, particularly Pythagoras. The tradition went all the way up to Newton, and I think it's survived in many forms, that really like truth is available to us through the portal of the imagination, through direct apprehension. And I think that's a really, really powerful insight, because I think then, because that can then humble us to then go and explore what those truths are, what the muse is saying to us, so to speak.
I think a huge aspect of this whole area that we're getting into as well, like these higher levels, it's like it is very empowering, and that's just the nature of it. There's a lot of power there, but I think one aspect of that is that it places the focus within as well, that it's I had this idea in my mind that I wanted to create a video about. It's like the old paradigm is like looking without for authority, or looking to external authorities for guidance, for approval, for wisdom, for knowledge. Whereas like this higher level is about looking within and understanding that all of that is within, and that it can be accessed, intuition, gut feeling, gut instinct. It's all there, can be tapped into, and I think that's a lot of what it's about as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's what God is. Well, I think that's one lens on it, at least, is that God is the boundless potentiality within you. And I think that's what false idols means as well, is like when you put your focus out into these external authorities, they're all false idols, but what's the true unity is what's coming from within.
Yeah, this really ties in with like Gnostic ideas as well, isn't it? Of like the the divine spark within that. God isn't just all that is, but it's also like a divine spark that's within each person and each being, and it's like a guidance system in a way.
Well, the Gnostics actually, in Gnostic theology, we are gods, in the sense that we emanate from a place called the pleroma, which is a field of light and beauty, and basically that we've become trapped in a material world by basically a catastrophe, like in the beginning, and that the archons are these like malevolent forces trying to keep us like kind of on that level, but that really the goal of life is to liberate that divine spark within us, which is just to realize ourselves, right? And that comes through knowledge or direct seeing, what they call gnosis, which is visionary ecstasy, intuition, imagination, psychedelic experience. All of these things I think are doorways into that, with their forms of gnosis.
I really like that ideology. Like I resonate with Gnosticism in general. Like I felt drawn to it for quite some time. I think one issue I have with it, and I don't know, this is probably just a little quibble or whatever, but I feel like with Gnosticism, with the whole idea of the archons and like how we're tied into materiality, that's, for me, that sometimes paints the picture that like the earth is inherently evil or something. Whereas I think there's this other element to it as well, that like material life on this planet can be very beautiful. You know, like nature is incredibly beautiful, and I think as well there is another side to it that, yeah, we might be transcending up to higher levels, but I think we can make the world very beautiful as well, a very beautiful place to live. And I think a lot of the negativity, the evil, is just these lower states still operating. And I think they can be let go of, the world can be transformed into a much better place. So, yeah, maybe that's just my misunderstanding of Gnosticism, because I haven't fully looked into
No, that's a key issue in it, actually. Like, I'd recommend, you might already be aware of this, but Terence McKenna there's some videos on YouTube available if you just type Terence McKenna Gnosticism, and he touches directly on that point, because basically you get, that's a central element of it, is the rejection of matter. And so he basically says you can go two ways on that. You can either reject the values of the earth entirely and say that we're star beings and that we are meant to ascend the body entirely, which is a possibility he remains open to. And then the other one is that actually it's about a veneration of the earth and bringing consciousness to the earth. And I think that's kind of what I alluded to earlier with that Gaian awakening idea. So I kind of feel more that way, because I think consciousness is really attention and care and love, and like I think we can kind of cultivate the mind to such an extent that it flows back into matter, which is the alchemical dream, because matter and mind are the same thing in alchemy. And so if you refine the mind, the divine spark, and you refine it into this like the perfect form of knowledge, and then that flows back down, that's kind of the achievement of the philosopher's stone, is the potentiating this divine spark of truth and like reaching that singularity, as you said, and then that radically affects the whole structure of matter itself by charging it with light.
I resonate so much more with that kind of perspective than I do with, let's say, the idea that we're purely spiritual and that the material is purely evil, you know, because, yeah, like Charles Eisenstein, again, to bring him back into it, like he comes at it from the perspective that we've separated out like spirit from matter, and we've come to see them as two separate things, but he's all about like actually reuniting them, you know, because his whole theme is reunion. So, you know, what if matter is inherently divine as well? You know, what if it's one and the same, spirit and matter? You know, you can have a separation of them conceptually, and it can be helpful, but what if the two are united as well? You know, and yeah, I tend to like view it that way as well. You know, there's Bible.
That's the alchemical idea too. Yeah.
Yeah, there's Bible quotes about it as well, like how basically Eckhart Tolle, he mentioned this in a New Earth, you know, like that all of nature is waiting for mankind to awaken, because like you said, when that happens, we're imbuing our consciousness back into the material, and the whole thing just lights up, you know. And I think nature lights up as well, and I think that's way more powerful. At least I feel that's more powerful, you know, as opposed to this narrative of like, oh, material is like a prison, you're just looking to transcend that, you know.
I suppose my thinking on that point is that I think the prison is, the way I think about it, it's a subtle point and a really important point. I think the way I think about that is I just think of it like the light is trapped in matter, in the sense that it's only concerned, like we said, with this like one lens, like with Requiem for a Dream or something. It's like it's only the light, which is our consciousness, is trapped in a rigid structure, which is the material world. My interpretation is not that the material world is per se evil. I think that's like conflating it, I think. But the point is that the energy, the mind, the psyche, the soul is like locked in there in an unhealthy and pathological way, and that the goal or the meaning of life is to kind of like extract that out, like separate that out, reflux that out, and then like constellate that and flow that back out. And I think that's what a lot of alchemy is about.
Yeah, definitely. That's how I pretty much see it as well. You know, like I don't see matter or material as inherently evil, like some of the Gnostics talk about, but I see it that the lower states are kind of they're the prison, you know, that's what keeps us mired in something limited, you know, and it's about just breaking out of that. But I think once we do collectively, then, like I was saying earlier, the material can really be appreciated then from the right place, you know, where it's like you can see the beauty of nature, you can beautify it even further, and you can also dwell in, you know, spiritual realms or whatever. But yeah, I think that's one issue with Gnosticism that I think needs maybe clarity or modern contextualization, you know.
100%. Yeah. So let's just wrap it up with these final slides on gratitude and love. And I think like yeah, I mean, this is really like one of the main themes in what we've been talking about, gratitude and surrender. And this is from Frederick Dodson from a book called Levels of Energy, and it's really similar to Hawkins's work. I think you probably
I've been meaning to check that out, actually. I haven't read it yet, but I heard it's supposed to be very good as well, you know.
Yeah, it's good. I liked it. I think it adds other lenses to it. I think reading Hawkins is a lot more powerful and lays the groundwork, but I think this really helps it builds on it in a really interesting way, I find.
Yeah.
So Dodson says, this energy field emanates appreciation of all of life. This is gratitude. Genuine care for others, which arises naturally, enjoyment of simple things over common problems within minutes, gratitude for the gifts life offers, the complete and total acceptance of things as they are, which facilitates the ability to change them, and awe at the beauty of life. This person does not fight anything, but flows with complete trust in the processes of life. Force is not used to achieve anything. No resistance is offered to what happens. I love that. And it's in keeping with Lao Tzu's quote from the Taoist tradition, where he says that nature does not hurry, and yet everything is accomplished through nature.
It's the same quote as in the Bible, isn't it? It's see how the lilies, they neither spin or toil or whatever, but
That's
they
right.
still produce, you know, they still grow.
And this is another interesting idea about harmony, because this is natural philosophy. What alchemy is a branch of natural philosophy, and it's so beautiful because it's thinking in the style of nature is a very interesting exercise. Thinking like a tree, you know, a tree is very patient. Because a tree is thinking on these spans of time that are much bigger than a human being. And so if you can tune your mind in to the fact that all nature is the same, and that what would a tree think about this, or like what would it be like to think about a tree, then like it might offer a new context for the struggles you're going through. Because I think humans can get a really like compressed idea of time, and like, but if you're just like an oak tree looking at this whole thing, you'd be like, it's how it happens, you know. Growth happens slowly.
That's an incredibly powerful point, because like I thought of Terence McKenna, you know, he said like in one of his lectures, like forget about the media, forget about school, like sit in front of a waterfall, sit in front of a tree, like what can they teach you, you know. And there's just, like you said, there's just so much wisdom there. And this is for me, this is something I feel I'm beginning to connect with through Qigong. Like I've been getting into that lately, and what's really fascinating with that is there's just so much wisdom there. Again, it's like Lao Tzu and Taoism, you know, it's ancient Chinese knowledge, and it's been there for thousands of years. And what they did was they tuned into nature just like that, you know. So you have like what's called the 5 animal frolics, where each sequence is modeling some creature, you know, like the crane, the bear. I think there's a few other ones as well. And it's just soaking in the wisdom of nature through movement, you know. But I have a great book on it actually, The Way of Qigong. I don't know if you can see that, The Way of Qigong by Kenneth S. Korn. And he talks as well about, you can literally just stand in front of a tree or sit in front of a tree, and with intention, there can be an exchange of energy, you know, an exchange knowledge and insights intuitively, you know. So I think that's definitely a thing as well.
Definitely, yeah. I think that's one of the big insights I got from a psychedelic experience, was just like, it felt like remembering that truth, like, and just feeling the messages of the trees, like, and yeah, no, it's so powerful. And I think, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say quickly, there's another great book on this if you want to check it out, or any of the other people watching. So Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm by Stephen Harrod Bunner. And he talks all about this, and a lot of what you said as well earlier about like Gaia and stuff. He's really into like the deep ecology, Gaia theory. So basically, and he's also into like archetypes and metaphysical. So he ties it all together, but with a focus on plants and plant intelligence. And he comes at it from the perspective of like the world we see is like the dream of Gaia. It's a dream called into being by the earth, by Gaia. And the plants are far more intelligent than we realize as well, and there's the possibility for communication, there's the possibility for like exchange of knowledge, and we're kind of shut off to that in our society. I guess part of it is kind of what we talked about earlier, like reason, pride, dogma, that it's blocking that right side of the brain, the intuition. And if we can only open that up, and this is what I find really exciting, is like, as collectively we move towards these higher states and the right side of the brain starts coming online, the intuition, there's actually a whole world of like knowledge and wisdom that we tap into, and it's incredible.
Yeah, no, I find that super exciting too. I think like the imagination is just such a mysterious power, which does come from nature. I think of it as the incarnation of, well, yeah, it is nature within you. It's like the feminine deity, like Gaia, the soul, like the anima, like that is your unconscious mind, and like the thing is like, are we tuned into it? And I think that's what I learned a lot from Jung about that. Like I think psychedelics and reading Jung have both acquainted me to the reality of the unconscious and the importance of dialoguing with the unconscious, and the understanding that the unconscious knows far more than the conscious mind can ever know. And so being open to it works wonders. And I think it's super important. This thing we read out here, I think this is really important as well, because gratitude is a context basically of acceptance and appreciation, and I think that is a super important context, because I think that's where things do become effortless, and where you can follow your imagination and intuition effortlessly. And we were talking before about sharing knowledge, and I think basically love, which is the next slide, love is basically giving, and basically generosity, the generous care, and what is like the soil from which love springs. And I think it's gratitude, because really it's when we really know and we really see that we have not enough, but like an abundance of just amazing miracles, like the miracle of being alive, the miracle of nutrition, the miracle of all of these things. And our consciousness, the context, the lens kind of orients towards that. So it's like, whoa, like, wow, I'm so blessed to like have all of these things. I think that in itself is a generative moment, because then the natural thing is give, give your love, give your care, give your knowledge, give everything you have, like, in service of this world, because we've inherited so much. It's actually like, I think of it like a reciprocity, like we've been given so much that when you wake up to how much you've been given, it just triggers that reciprocity thing where you're like, oh, I want to give back. Like
100%. It's like, and that's a really interesting, like, subtle but good revelation there of like, it's about waking up to how much is already there, and it's like, in a way, we're asleep to the abundance that's there, and that's what blocks the generosity, and yeah, it ties in as well with like the idea of gift economy and the gift cycle. You know, like how if you look at nature, that's a lot of it is how it is. And the guy I mentioned as well, interestingly, Stephen Harold Bunner, in that book, Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm, he talks about this as well, how nature is actually far more about symbiosis and cooperation than it is about competition. And you know, it's interesting because even today, like still the current, you can feel into the collective unconscious that the view of nature is one of like struggle and competition. You know, that without civilization, it would be like a brutish struggle. And, you know, it's all about dog eat dog, it's all about competition. But in a way, that's really just projection of our current state in society when we're run by these negative emotions collectively, that we feel a lot of scarcity and competition. We project that onto nature. When in reality, you know, as we transcend up these levels, we realize that nature is inherently about gift, it's about generosity, it's about reciprocity, as you said, you know, and it's about abundance, you know, and anything other than that is just illusion. Um, so yeah, then on the individual level, it's about waking up to that too, you know, and like you said, it's just realizing what we have, appreciating that, and yeah, that's when the giving stems from that, you know, all love stems from that, I guess.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so just the final Hawkins quote. So love takes no position and thus is global, rising above separation. Love is therefore inclusive and expands the sense of self progressively. Love focuses on the goodness of life and in all its expressions and augments that which is positive. It dissolves negativity by recontextualizing it rather than by attacking it. That idea of context is massive in Hawkins, and it's so good. And if you think about this lens idea, I really like that metaphor because love is the ultimate lens. Really, it's the ultimate meaning structure that helps us to understand and transcend our suffering in many ways, to understand just the gift of life.
Yeah, definitely. I like this lens as well of like recontextualizing rather than attacking, you know, because that reminds me of a quote by Philip K. Dick. He wrote the book "Do Androids Dream of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep," and that became the material for the Blade Runner series of films, you know. And so basically, uh, the quote was, "To fight the empire is to become the empire, and those who attack it become infected by its derangement." You know, something like that. And that's a principle that you see playing out a lot. Is like when you attack something or resist it, it grows. And not only that, but you can become the very thing that you championed against. You know. Whereas then love is about kind of just embracing that, and it's kind of moves around it, you know. So I think that's a powerful distinction.
100%. And like I think it ties in with creation and the imagination too, because I think the best way to fight evil, so to speak, if you think of evil as ignorance, which the Gnostics did, the best way to fight evil is through knowledge, like through creative, it's like through an act of creation, through an act of speaking your truth, doing something positive and expansive by launching a new idea, sharing a new theme, offering a new perspective, offering a new lens, but doing something proactive and positive and voluntarily offering a paradigm. You give no energy to the evil. And I think that it's the butterfly effect thing again. It's because if like one person does that, if 100 person do that, if 1,000 people do that, if 1,000,000 people do that, then you know the power structure has nothing to feed on at all.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I just wanted to quickly say, like, yeah, what you said there is just like what's happening that's the whole process in essence, isn't it? Is that divesting energy from those old emotions and the system that sprung up from that, and that's its undoing basically. It's like, you know, focusing on the vision you want to build is far more powerful than attacking that which you want to move away from. And it's like that's what's happening collectively. And I think like with recent events at the time of recording with the coronavirus pandemic, that is possibly even accelerating that so many people are, you know, being forced to sit with themselves, to go within, to question these narratives, you know, and maybe to divest some energy from these old beliefs, these old emotions, and to put them towards something new. And I think that's what it's all leading to, is like, you know, basically moving towards these states, embodying them more and more. And it's got a kind of a, as we talked about earlier, it's got a kind of an exponential element to it as well, a quickening, you know. I think that's what we're seeing is happening. And I think with that, a lot of the old emotions and traumas are kind of coming up to the surface for processing as well. You know, that's part of it. But I think ultimately it's going in a very good direction, and that's why I feel like very optimistic, even though if you tune into the news or whatever, everything seems like negative. Like that's a certain context, it's a certain reality, but it's limited from a higher perspective, you know. And I think that higher perspective is just understanding the inner shifts that are happening for people and what that is leading to. It's a new earth, basically, you know, as Eckhart Tolle called it. And even in the Bible, they talk about that, you know. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth had disappeared, and there was no longer any sea. Like how I take sea to me is like separation, you know. So like it's a unification, it's a synthesis, and yeah, embodying this idea of the gift more as well, you know, generosity, reciprocity, which just rises naturally from it, you know, and that then reshaping everything, you know, society, economy, just daily interactions, you know, greater levels of intimacy, connection, fulfillment. That's kind of where I see it heading to, you know.
Yeah, man, that was beautiful.
Nice one. I just want to say, it passed over 9 o'clock, and I had a blocker set up on my computer, so like I literally got locked out of the screen. Like I can't see now. So yeah, I mean, do you want to give any like final thoughts, like your own summary, and maybe after that I'll just like pop in and see if I can, you know, end the recording then.
Cool. Yeah, no, I mean, it's I think what we've talked through is a really interesting lens and model and perspective for understanding our own emotional life and also the life of our broader society. I think love is the truth, and I think truth and love are the deepest values of the human heart, and I think we've covered a lot of those things today, and everything we've done was in the spirit of truth and love. And yeah, I just think it's a powerful thing to share these kind of ideas. And my sense is that the more people do things like what we're doing now, the less people tune into a false narrative context of the world that is based on fear and separation. Like, and I think it's that positive thing versus attacking it, and in the spirit of love, because I know I do personally, like I would prefer to listen to a deep dialogue around religion or morality or philosophy or just something interesting and insightful on YouTube or wherever I can find it, or read a book or something. I'd much prefer that energy to this, like what the mass media does with like splicing it up and trying to like just this like really false, really so obviously false narrative lens that produces it just doesn't produce good things. And I think it's the divesting of energy, like you said, which I really believe in, and the investing of that energy into things that are productive and expansive. I think that's awesome, and I think that's an awesome I think so many things in history have conspired for this to be the case. I think the fact that more and more people are literate and able to articulate life to themselves, that wasn't the case throughout history. And then we've inherited all this knowledge of humanity, and now we've got an internet, which is wicked, to just share it with everyone who cares to look. So I mean, you know, like, I don't think ignorance has much of a chance of prevailing under such conditions. I think what is happening is an amazing release of knowledge and human potential. I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, definitely. It's like the age of Aquarius is said to be the age of information, you know, so it's all about the truth coming to life, and, you know, coming to light, and there's that Greek word as well, apocalypse, which means it comes from apocalypsis, which means a lifting of the veil, you know, which is what we're seeing as well, especially through the internet, that all these myths and these false beliefs are just crumbling, and the truth is coming out, you know, and it really just ties all back in with what we discussed throughout the whole talk, that like truth and power are very synonymous, you know, that they're connected, and there is an inherent power to truth, and it's why truth prevails, you know, that truth will always come to light and good will always prevail. It's like that analogy with the Lord of the Rings as well, how, you know, the good forces, they're integrous, they're cohesive, whereas the darkness, which is just the absence of light, is disintegrous, you know, and it's scattered, you know. So it just feels, and I believe it is, an inevitable process. And I think we're at a very important point in it now where it's accelerating. And I think, like you said, yeah, through the internet and just through the sharing of these kind of videos, just speaking like this, it's very powerful, and it gives others courage to do the same. You know, it's like that morphic resonance principle, and it's all these little things like these, you know, countless people creating videos like this, or this is just one example, you know, doing all different acts that align with a newer paradigm, that it's creating that shift, you know. So I think that's it in essence, you know, that's where it's headed.
Yeah, man. Thanks for your time to talk through all this. I think it's really cool because I know you're aware of this, you know, this body of work, David Hawkins' work, and I think it's cool that we've both studied it and are able to kind of talk through and think through it all, because I think it's really important. I think it's really cool way of understanding things. Yeah, so I think we did a lot here.
It was, yeah, really good, like, synergy, and I think there was a lot of ideas bubbled up, all of us that were new, and I think it's a good, like, wealth of information for people to just immerse in, and if they're new to David Hawkins as well, I think it'll be very insightful and powerful. So yeah, thanks for organising the slides as well, and thanks for taking the time to talk as well. It was really good.
Yeah. Cool, man. Let's call it a day.
Yeah, so I think with this blocker thing,